In the shadowed halls of Blackthorn Manor, a priceless silver treasure vanishes in the blink of an eye. A muddy footprint fades to nowhere, a broken cork whispers of haste, and a sapphire-starred brooch hides a shocking disguise. I'm Jane Marple, and in this maze of secrets, where every guest harbours a motive, pride, greed, or fear, the truth lies buried in the whispers of the wine cellar. Who stole the silver, and why? The answer is closer than you think. Chapter 1. The Invitation to Blackthorn. Manor Miss Jane Marple sat in her neat parlour in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles moving with the quiet rhythm of a metronome. The afternoon sun slanted through the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows on the chintz-covered armchair where she sat. On the table beside her, a cup of tea steamed gently, its fragrance mingling with the faint scent of lavender from the garden. Her eyes, bright and bird-like behind her spectacles, were fixed on a cream-coloured envelope adorned with an embossed crest, a thorn-wreathed tower, the insignia of Blackthorn Manor. The letter, penned in an elegant hand, bore an invitation from Lady Beatrice Harrow, a name that stirred faint ripples of memory in Miss Marple's mind. Beatrice Harrow, the last of an old and once wealthy family, was known in the county for her reclusive habits and the crumbling grandeur of her ancestral home. The invitation proposed a weekend gathering to celebrate the unveiling of a rare vintage wine collection, a curious event for a woman who shunned society's spotlight. Miss Marple's fingers paused, a skein of wool resting lightly in her lap. She sensed an undercurrent of purpose beneath the polite words, as if the invitation were a thread in a larger, unseen pattern. "People do not change," she murmured to herself, recalling whispers of Beatrice's financial straits and her fierce pride in the Harrow name. With a nod, as if confirming a private suspicion, she resolved to attend, her curiosity piqued by the prospect of unravelling whatever lay beneath this summons. The journey to Blackthorn Manor was a brisk affair, the train rattling through the autumnal countryside where golden leaves clung stubbornly to the trees. Miss Marple, dressed in her sensible tweed coat and a hat pinned with a modest brooch, observed her fellow passengers with quiet interest, her mind cataloguing their mannerisms as one might sort skeins of yarn. At the station, a dour chauffeur in a black cap awaited her, ushering her into a sleek Rolls-Royce that seemed at odds with the manor's rumoured decay. The drive wound through moorland, where heather bowed under a restless wind, and the sky hung heavy with the promise of rain. Blackthorn Manor emerged from the mist like a Gothic relic, its spires jagged against the bruised horizon. Ivy clung to its stone facade, and the tall windows gleamed dully, as if guarding secrets. Miss Marple stepped from the car, her small suitcase in hand, and was greeted at the heavy oak door by Lady Beatrice herself. Beatrice was a striking woman in her mid-30s, her pale skin and dark eyes framed by auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her smile was warm, yet Miss Marple noted a flicker of calculation in her gaze, like a hostess weighing the worth of her guests. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," Beatrice said, her voice smooth as polished silver. "I trust the journey was not too taxing." "Not at all, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her eyes alert. "I find train journeys rather invigorating. One sees so much of human nature." Beatrice led her into a cavernous hall, where a chandelier cast fractured light on a marble floor veined with age. The air smelled faintly of wax and old wood, and a grand staircase curved upward into shadow. The other guests, already arrived, were gathered by a roaring fire in the drawing-room, their voices a low hum against the crackle of logs. Beatrice made introductions with practiced grace, and Miss Marple, ever observant, took stock of her companions. Sir Reginald Voss, a florid man with a bristling moustache, held court with a glass of sherry, his booming voice extolling the virtues of a 1904 Bordeaux. His manner suggested wealth, but Miss Marple noted the frayed cuffs of his otherwise impeccable suit. Clara Dunhill, a young journalist with ink-stained fingers and a nervous habit of twisting her scarf, seemed out of place, her eyes darting as if seeking a story in every corner. Dr. Felix Mortimer, a retired chemist with a lean face and a penchant for cryptic remarks, adjusted his spectacles and offered Miss Marple a nod that was more appraising than polite. Victor Crane, a handsome art dealer with slicked-back hair and a smile too polished, lounged against the mantel, his charm as carefully curated as the paintings he claimed to trade. The final guest, a woman introduced as Mrs. Evelyn Grey, stood apart, her face obscured by a veiled hat that seemed more suited to a funeral than a celebration. She murmured a greeting, her voice low and her hands clasped tightly, as if guarding a secret. Miss Marple's instincts stirred. Mrs. Grey's reticence was not mere shyness, but something deliberate, like a card held close in a game of bridge. As the group exchanged pleasantries, Beatrice announced that dinner would be served shortly, followed by a descent to the wine cellar for the unveiling of her collection. A rare treat, she said, her eyes gleaming. The Harrow cellars hold bottles older than this house itself. The promise of such a spectacle drew murmurs of anticipation, but Miss Marple, sipping her tea, felt a prickle of unease. In her experience, gatherings like this were rarely what they seemed, and Blackthorn Manor, with its shadowed halls and guarded hostess, whispered of something more than wine. Chapter 2. The Silver's Disappearance. The dining room at Blackthorn Manor was a study in faded opulence, its long mahogany table reflecting the flicker of candlelight from the Harrow family's silver, a magnificent set of goblets, candelabras, and a centerpiece epergne, each piece intricately wrought with the thorn-wreathed tower of the family crest. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted pheasant and beeswax, and the tall windows, framed by damask curtains, offered glimpses of the darkening moor beyond. Miss Jane Marple, seated between Clara Dunhill and Dr. Felix Mortimer, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes missing nothing. Lady Beatrice Harrow presided at the head of the table, her auburn hair catching the light as she raised a glass of claret in a toast. "To heritage," she said, her voice clear but tinged with an emotion Miss Marple could not quite place. Bride, perhaps, or something more calculated. To the treasures of Blackthorn Manor, both liquid and solid. Her gaze lingered on the silver, and Miss Marple noted a faint tightening of her lips, as if the words carried a private weight. The guests responded with murmurs of agreement, though their enthusiasm varied. Sir Reginald Voss, his face flushed from the wine, launched into a monologue about the historical significance of silver craftsmanship, his gestures broad enough to nearly topple a goblet. "These pieces," he declared, "are not mere tableware, but relics of an era when artistry was paramount. I'd wager their worth a king's ransom." His eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple wondered if his interest was purely academic, or if the mention of value hinted at a more personal curiosity. Clara Dunhill, picking at her plate, seemed distracted, her pencil hovering over a small notebook she'd slipped from her pocket. When Miss Marple inquired gently about her work, Clara started, tucking the notebook away. "Just notes for my article," she said, her voice high. "Lady Beatrice's wine collection is the real story, but this silverit's quite something. isn't it?" Her eyes darted to the epergne, and Miss Marple sensed an eagerness that went beyond journalistic zeal. Dr. Mortimer, on Miss Marple's other side, offered little to the conversation, his lean fingers tracing the rim of his glass as he listened to Sir Reginald with a faint, sardonic smile. "Silver is all very well," he remarked, "but it's the wine I'm here for. Chemistry in a bottle, you might say." His tone was dry, and Miss Marple noted his habit of deflecting questions about himself, as if he preferred to remain a cipher. Victor Crane, seated opposite, was all charm, his dark eyes flashing as he complimented Beatrice's hospitality. Yet Miss Marple observed his hands restless, fidgeting with his napkin, betraying a tension his smile did not quite conceal. He spoke of art auctions in London, but his glances strayed repeatedly to the silver, lingering on the candelabras with an intensity that seemed more than casual appreciation. Mrs. Evelyn Grey, the enigmatic guest in her veiled hat, ate sparingly, her movements precise and contained. She responded to questions with monosyllables, her voice muffled by the veil, and Miss Marple found her reticence intriguing. There was something staged about Mrs. Grey's demeanour, as if she were playing a part in a drama only she understood. When Beatrice addressed her directly, asking about a supposed family connection, Mrs. Grey's reply was vague, a distant tie long forgotten. Miss Marple's instincts prickled. Distant cousins, in her experience, were rarely so elusive without reason. The meal progressed through courses of consomme, pheasant, and a delicate lemon soufflé, the conversation weaving between the mundane and the pointed. Beatrice spoke of the wine cellar's history, describing bottles laid down by her great-grandfather, a collector of rare vintages. "The unveiling tonight," she said, "will be a moment to remember. The 1892 Chateau Lafite is the jewel of the collection." Her enthusiasm seemed genuine, but Miss Marple detected a note of strain, as if the event were a performance with stakes beyond mere celebration. As the dessert plates were cleared, Beatrice rose, inviting the guests to follow her to the wine cellar. The group moved through the manor's shadowed corridors, their footsteps echoing on the stone floors. Miss Marple, trailing behind, noted the layout a warren of passages branching off the main hall, some leading to servants' quarters, others to locked doors whose purposes were unclear. The air grew cooler as they descended a spiral staircase to the cellar, its iron railings cold under Miss Marple's gloved hand. The wine cellar was a vast, vaulted chamber, its stone walls damp and its air thick with the musty scent of aged oak. Racks stretched into the shadows, each cradling bottles dusted with time. A single chandelier hung from the ceiling, its candles casting a golden glow that danced on the glass. Beatrice stood by a central rack where a bottle of 1892 Chateau Lafite rested on a velvet cushion. "This," she said, her voice resonant, "in the cavernous space is a wine of legend. My father swore it was the finest he ever tasted." She lifted the bottle, her movements reverent, and began to work the corkscrew. The guests gathered closer, their faces lit by anticipation. Sir Reginald muttered about the vintage's rarity, while Clara scribbled furiously in her notebook. Dr. Mortimer adjusted his spectacles, his expression unreadable, and Victor leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the bottle. Mrs. Grey stood at the edge of the group, her veiled figure barely visible in the dim light. Miss Marple, standing near the rack, felt a draught from somewhere deep in the cellar, as if a hidden passage stirred the air. Beatrice had just extracted the cork with a soft pop when a piercing scream shattered the moment. The guests froze, their heads turning toward the staircase. Heavy footsteps thudded above, followed by the clatter of a tray. Mr. Hodges, the butler, appeared at the cellar door, his face ashen, his usual composure shattered. "My lady," he gasped, "the silver, it's gone." A collective gasp rose. From the group, Beatrice set the bottle down with a trembling hand, her eyes wide. "Gone? How can that be? We were all here." Her voice held a mix of shock and indignation, but Miss Marple, watching closely, noted a fleeting expression, almost relief, cross her face, before it hardened into dismay. The guests hurried up the staircase, Miss Marple following at a measured pace, her mind already turning over the possibilities. The dining room, when they reached it, was eerily unchanged, save for the glaring absence of the silver. The tablecloth was smooth, the chairs undisturbed, and the windows remained latched, their heavy curtains unmoved. The goblets, candelabras, and epergne had vanished, as if spirited away by some unseen hand. Sir Reginald blustered, his moustache quivering. "This is outrageous. A theft under our noses. We must summon the constabulary at once." His voice boomed, but Miss Marple sensed a performative quality, as if he relished the drama. Beatrice, however, raised a hand, her expression resolute. "No police, Sir Reginald. Not yet. Blackthorn Manor has weathered scandals before, and I'll not have its name dragged through the mud. We shall resolve this ourselves." Her tone brooked no argument, though her hands twisted together. Betraying her agitation, Miss Marple stepped forward, her demeanour calm but her eyes sharp. "Might I suggest we examine the room? There may be clues to guide us." Her voice was soft, almost deferential, but it carried the weight of authority born from countless quiet observations. The guests spread out, their movements a mix of curiosity and unease. Clara knelt by the table, peering at the carpet, while Victor inspected the windows, his fingers lingering on the latches. Dr. Mortimer stood back, his arms crossed, watching the others as if they were specimens in a laboratory. Mrs. Gray remained. Near the door, her veiled face unreadable, her silence louder than any protest. Miss Marple's gaze settled on a faint smudge on the carpet, near a side door that led to the garden. It was mud, still damp, forming a partial footprint that trailed toward the door but stopped abruptly, as if the culprit had vanished mid-step. She knelt, her fingers brushing the carpet, and noted the texture-rich, loamy soil, likely from the moor. The door itself was unlocked, its bolt loose. But the garden beyond showed no signs of disturbance, no trampled grass, no broken twigs. "Curious," Miss Marple murmured, straightening. She turned to Hodges, who hovered nearby, wringing his hands. "Mr. Hodges, were any servants in the dining room during our time in the cellar?" "No, madam," he replied, his voice unsteady. "The staff were in the kitchen, preparing for the late supper. I was with them until I heard a noise, a clatter, like metal falling, and came to check. And you saw no one?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "No one, madame." The room was empty, but the silver key trailed off, gesturing helplessly. At the bare table, Beatrice, her face pale, sank into a chair. "This is a disaster," she said, her voice breaking. "The silver is irreplaceable, a symbol of my family's honor. Whoever did this has struck at the heart of Blackthorn Manor." Her eyes filled with tears, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. But Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the careful placement of each gesture, as if rehearsed. Clara, still by the table, pointed to a faint scratch on the wood, barely visible in the candlelight. "Could this be from the silver being moved?" she asked, her voice eager. Miss Marple examined the mark, a shallow gouge that suggested something heavy had been dragged. It was near the edge of the table, closest to the side door, but it offered no clear direction. Victor, returning from the windows, shook his head. No signs of forced entry. Whoever did this knew the house well. His tone was casual, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease in his eyes, as if he regretted speaking. Dr. Mortimer cleared his throat. A clever thief, perhaps, but not invisible. There must be a logical explanation. His words were measured, but his gaze lingered on Beatrice, as if testing her reaction. Mrs. Gray, still silent, stepped closer to the side door, her gloved hand brushing the handle. "Perhaps the thief escaped through here," she said, her voice low. "The moor is vast easy to disappear into." Her suggestion was plausible, but Miss Marple noted the way her hand lingered, as if she knew more than she let on. Beatrice rose, her composure returning. "We must search the house," she declared. "The silver cannot have gone far. I'll have Hodges organize the staff." She turned to Miss Marple, her eyes pleading. "Miss Marple, you have a reputation for insight. Will you help us?" Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression serene but her mind racing. "I shall do what I can, my dear. A theft like this is a puzzle, and puzzles, in my experience, have a way of revealing their pieces." She glanced at the muddy smudge, the scratched table, and the guarded faces around her, sensing that the truth lay not in the silver's absence, but in the motives of those who coveted it. As the guests dispersed to begin their search, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes tracing the room's contours. The silver's disappearance was no mere theft, she felt certain, but a carefully staged act in a drama whose script was yet to be uncovered. And somewhere, in the shadows of Blackthorn Manor, a whisper waited to be heard. Chapter 3. The scene of the crime, the dining room at Blackthorn Manor. So recently aglow with the warmth of candlelight and the gleam of the Harrow family silver, now stood silent, its grandeur marred by the stark absence of the precious heirlooms. The long mahogany table, stripped of its goblets, candelabras, and epergne, seemed almost forlorn, the candlelight casting wavering shadows that danced across the polished surface like spectres of the stolen treasure. Miss Jane Marple, standing near the side door where the muddy smudge had caught her eye, surveyed the room with a quiet intensity, her hands clasped lightly before her, her mind as sharp as the knitting needles she wielded at home. The air held a faint chill, as if the manor itself mourned the loss, and the guests, gathered in a loose semicircle, wore expressions ranging from indignation to unease. Lady Beatrice Harrow, her pale face drawn, stood at the head of the table, her fingers gripping the back of a chair as if to steady herself. "This is unthinkable," she said, her voice low but resonant with a tremor that might have been grief or something else entirely. "The silver has been in my family for generations. To lose it now, in my own home." She trailed off, her eyes sweeping the room, lingering on each guest as if seeking a culprit among them. Miss Marple, observing closely, noted the way Beatrice's gaze paused on Victor Crane, whose charming facade seemed to falter under her scrutiny. Sir Reginald Voss, his florid cheeks flushed with a mix of wine and outrage, paced near the fireplace, his heavy steps muffled by the thick carpet. "A scandal, that's what this is," he declared, his moustache bristling. "A thief among us, and not a soul saw a thing. We must search every inch of this house at once." His bluster filled the room, but Miss Marple sensed a performative quality, as if he were playing the role of the affronted gentleman rather than truly believing in an immediate resolution. Clara Dunhill, the young journalist, hovered near the table, her notebook clutched tightly, her eyes darting between the empty spaces where the silver had stood and the muddy smudge on the carpet. "It's like a ghost took it," she murmured, half to herself, then flushed as she caught Miss Marple's gaze. "I mean, it's just so strange, no noise, no broken locks. How could someone walk off with all that silver in minutes?" Her curiosity was palpable, but Miss Marple detected a hint of opportunism, as if Clara saw the theft as a chance to elevate her article into something sensational. Dr. Felix Mortimer, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, offered a wry comment. "A ghost, Miss Dunhill? Hardly. Thieves are flesh and blood, and they leave traces, even if they think they don't." His tone was cool, almost detached, but his eyes flicked toward the side door, where the muddy smudge lay. Miss Marple noted his interest, wondering if his scientific mind was already piecing together a theory or guarding one of his own. Victor Crane, standing near the windows, ran a hand through his sleek hair, his usual polish dimmed by a faint sheen of perspiration. "The windows are secure," he said, his voice steady but his fingers twitching at his cufflinks. "I checked the latches myself. Whoever did this didn't come from outside." His assertion was reasonable, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance he cast toward Beatrice, as if seeking her approval or fearing her suspicion. Mrs. Evelyn Grey, the enigmatic guest in her veiled hat, remained near the threshold of the dining room, her gloved hands folded primly. She had said little since the discovery of the theft, her silence a contrast to the others' agitation. When Beatrice addressed her, asking if she'd noticed anything unusual, Mrs. Grey's reply was curt. "I was in the cellar, like everyone else." Her voice, muffled by the veil, carried a flatness that Miss Marple found curiously deliberate, as if she were reciting a prepared line. Miss Marple stepped forward, her small figure commanding attention despite her unassuming demeanor. "If I may," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "I believe a closer examination of the room might prove illuminating. Small details, you know, often tell a larger story." She moved toward the muddy smudge, kneeling with a grace that belied her years, her fingers brushing the carpet lightly. The mud was fresh, its dark, loamy texture suggesting it had been tracked in from the moor. The footprint, partial and smudged, was broad, perhaps a man's shoe, though the edges were indistinct, as if the culprit had taken care to obscure their tracks. The trail led to the side door, a heavy oak panel that opened onto a narrow path winding toward the garden. Miss Marple opened the door, letting in a gust of cool, damp air. The path outside was gravel, but the surrounding earth was soft from recent rain. Yet there were no further footprints, no signs of disturbance in the grass or shrubs. The trail stopped abruptly at the threshold, as if the thief had simply vanished. "Most peculiar," Miss Marple murmured, her eyes narrowing. She examined the doorframe, noting a faint scrape, barely visible in the dim lighter mark that suggested something heavy had brushed against it. Perhaps a sack or a crate used to carry the silver. Returning to the dining room, she studied the table itself. The scratch Clara had pointed out was indeed present, a shallow gouge near the edge, close to the side door. It was no more than an inch long, but its position suggested that the silver had been dragged rather than lifted, a curious choice for a thief in a hurry. Miss Marple ran her finger along the mark, her mind conjuring images of a hurried exit. The thief perhaps struggling with the weight of their loot. Yet the absence of noise puzzled her. The silver was heavy, and its removal should have caused a clatter. Yet Hodges had reported only a single sound, like metal falling. She turned her attention to the room's other features. The windows, as Victor had confirmed, were latched there, frames undisturbed. The fireplace, still smouldering, showed no signs of tampering, no ashes scattered, no hidden compartments. The walls, lined with portraits of stern-faced Harrow ancestors, offered no obvious hiding places. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on a tapestry near the side door, its faded threads depicting a hunt across the moors. She lifted its edge, revealing only bare stone, but the act prompted a memory of St. Mary Mead, where a similar tapestry had concealed a safe in old Mrs. Pritchard's drawing room. Here, however, the wall was solid, unyielding to her gentle taps. Beatrice, watching Miss Marple's methodical inspection, wrung her hands, her distress seeming to deepen. "What do you make of it, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice catching. "Is there any hope of recovering the silver?" Her eyes were wide, almost imploring, but Miss Marple, ever attuned to nuance, sensed a theatricality in her posture, as if Beatrice were playing the role of the bereaved heiress a touch too earnestly. "There is always hope." "My dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone soothing but her mind alert. "Thieves, you see, are not so clever as they think. They leave traces, as Dr. Mortimer rightly said, and those traces often betray them." She glanced at the muddy smudge again, her thoughts turning to the cellar, where the guests had been when the theft occurred. "Might we return to the cellar? It may hold answers we've overlooked." The group agreed, though their enthusiasm was tempered by unease. Beatrice led the way, her steps brisk but her shoulders tense. The staircase to the cellar was narrow, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The air grew colder as they descended, the scent of earth and oak intensifying. The cellar itself was as they had left it, the racks of bottles gleaming faintly under the chandelier's light. The 1892 Chateau Lafite stood on its velvet cushion, the cork beside it intact, its rich aroma lingering in the air. Miss Marple moved to the rack where the bottle had been displayed, her eyes scanning the floor. Near the base of the rack, half hidden by a shadow, lay a broken cork, its edges jagged as if snapped in haste. It bore the mark of a 1920 vintage, distinct from the 1892 bottle Beatrice had opened. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the cork lightly before slipping it into her pocket. "How very odd," she said, almost to herself. "A cork from another bottle, broken and discarded here. One wonders why." Dr. Mortimer, peering over her shoulder, offered a dismissive shrug. "Corks break easily enough," he said. "Perhaps someone was careless during a tasting." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes lingered on the rack, as if he, too, sensed its significance. Clara, ever eager, crouched beside Miss Marple. "Could it be a clue?" she asked, her voice tinged with excitement. "Maybe the thief dropped it while sneaking through the cellar." Her theory was plausible, but Miss Marple suspected Clara's enthusiasm stemmed more from a desire for a scoop than a genuine insight. Victor, pacing near the rack, paused to examine a bottle, his fingers brushing the label. "This place is a maze," he said, his tone light but his eyes restless. "A thief could hide anything down here." Miss Marple observed his movements, noting the faint trace of mud on his polished shoes mud that matched the smudge upstairs. She filed the observation away, her mind weaving connections between the cellar and the dining room. Mrs. Gray, standing near the staircase, said nothing, her veiled figure a dark silhouette against the stone wall. Miss Marple, glancing at her, wondered why she lingered so close to the exit, as if poised to flee. Beatrice, meanwhile, hovered by the central rack, her hands clasped tightly, "The cellar was locked before we arrived," she said, her voice defensive. "No one could have entered without my key." Her insistence was firm, but Miss Marple detected a flicker of doubt, as if Beatrice herself questioned the security of her domain. Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes sweeping the cellar's expanse. The racks stretched into the shadows, their wooden frames sturdy but aged, some sagging under the weight of the bottles. A faint draught stirred the air, its source unclear, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the possibility of hidden passages. Old houses like Blackthorn Manor often concealed such secrets, built for purposes ranging from smuggling to escape. She resolved to explore further, but for now, she kept her suspicions to herself, her demeanor as unassuming as ever, as the guests prepared to return upstairs. Sir Reginald, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "This is no ordinary theft," he said, his voice grave. "The silver's value is immense, but its loss is a blow to tradition. We must consider who among us had the opportunity and a motive." His words hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted the way the others reacted. Clara's quick glance at Beatrice, Victor's tightened jaw, Dr. Mortimer's faint smirk, and Mrs. Gray's subtle shift toward the shadows. Back in the dining room, Miss Marple lingered, her eyes returning to the muddy smudge and the scratched table. The clues were sparse, but they whispered of a thief who knew the house intimately, who moved with purpose and left only the barest traces. The broken cork, the abrupt end of the footprints, the absence of noise, all pointed to a plan both bold and meticulous. And yet Miss Marple felt certain the truth lay not in the clues themselves, but in the hearts of those who surrounded them. As the guests dispersed to their rooms, their murmurs of suspicion trailing behind them, Miss Marple remained by the side door, her mind as busy as her knitting needles. The scene of the crime was a stage, she thought, and the players, whether they knew it or not, had already begun to reveal their roles. The silver might be gone, but its absence was merely the opening act of a drama whose final curtain was yet to fall. Chapter 4. The Broken Cork. The morning after the theft at Blackthorn Manor broke with a grey pallor, the moorland mist pressing against the tall windows like a shroud. The dining room, stripped of its silver, seemed a hollow echo of the previous night's grandeur, its mahogany table bare save for a few breakfast dishes arranged with the quiet efficiency of the manor's staff. Miss Jane Marple sat at the table, her tea cooling in its cup, her eyes moving with deceptive mildness over the gathered guests. The air was thick with unspoken suspicions, and the clink of porcelain was the only sound breaking the strained silence. Lady Beatrice Harrow, seated at the head, wore a black silk dress that accentuated her pallor, her auburn hair pinned tightly as if to mirror her controlled demeanor. Yet Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers as she lifted her teacup, a sign of nerves. That belied her composed exterior. Sir Reginald Voss, his florid face less animated than the night before, buttered his toast with unnecessary vigor, his occasional glances at Beatrice tinged with something like reproach. Clara Dunhill, her notebook absent but her eyes alert, picked at a scone, her restlessness suggesting a mind eager to uncover secrets. Dr. Felix Mortimer, his lean frame slouched in his chair, stirred his tea methodically, his expression one of detached amusement, as if the theft were a puzzle to be solved rather than a crisis. Victor Crane, his charm dimmed by fatigue, sat with his shoulders hunched, his gaze flickering toward the side door where the muddy footprint had been found. Mrs. Evelyn Gray, still veiled and silent, occupied the farthest chair, her presence as elusive as a shadow in the mist, Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, let the conversation or lack thereof unfold around her. She had spent the early hours reflecting on the theft, her mind sifting through the clues like threads in a tapestry. The muddy footprint, stopping abruptly at the garden door, the shallow scratch on the dining table, the absence of noise during the theft all pointed to a thief who moved with intimate knowledge of the manor's rhythms. But it was the broken cork found in the wine cellar near the vintage rack that intrigued her most. Its jagged edges and 1920 vintage mark, distinct from the 1892 Chateau Lafite, opened by Beatrice, suggested a moment of haste or distraction, a small but telling misstep in an otherwise meticulous plan. As the butler, Mr. Hodges, refilled the teapot, Miss Marple spoke, her voice soft but carrying the weight of quiet authority. "Lady Beatrice, might we revisit the wine cellar this morning? The circumstances of last night were so chaotic, and I believe a second look in daylight might reveal something we overlooked." Her tone was deferential, but her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, missed nothing of Beatrice's reaction, a slight stiffening, followed by a quick nod. "Of course, Miss Marple," Beatrice replied, setting down her cup with care. "Anything that might help recover the silver. Though I confess I'm at a loss to understand how the cellar could hold answers." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple detected a faint edge, as if the suggestion stirred an unease she wished to conceal. The guests murmured their assent, some with more enthusiasm than others. Sir Reginald, his moustache twitching, declared it a waste of time, but agreed to join, lest he be thought uncooperative. Clara's eyes lit up, her journalistic instincts clearly piqued, while Dr. Mortimer offered a cryptic smile, as if amused by the prospect of further investigation. Victor hesitated, his fingers drumming briefly on the table before he nodded, his expression guarded. Mrs. Gray, as ever, said nothing, but her veiled head tilted slightly, as if listening intently. The group descended the spiral staircase to the cellar, the air growing cooler and heavier with each step. The chamber was as they had left it, its stone walls glistening faintly with damp, the racks of bottles stretching into the shadows like silent sentinels. The chandelier, unlit in the morning light filtering through a high, narrow window, cast no warmth, and the scent of oak and earth was more pronounced, mingling with the faint temps of spilled wine. Beatrice led them to the central rack, where the 1892 Chateau Lafite still rested on its velvet cushion, the intact cork beside it a mute witness to the previous night's ceremony. Miss Marple moved directly to the spot where she had found the broken cork, near the base of a rack containing bottles from the 1920s. The floor was clean, save for a few specks of dust, and the cork was gone, safely tucked in her handbag. She knelt, her movements deliberate, and examined the rack itself, noting the slight tilt of one shelf, as if it had been disturbed. Her fingers brushed the wood, detecting a faint stickiness residue, perhaps from a bottle recently handled. "Most curious," she murmured, her voice barely audible. She rose, her eyes scanning the surrounding racks, searching for anything out of place. Clara, hovering nearby, watched with undisguised curiosity. "Did you find something, Miss Marple?" she asked, her voice eager. "That cork you mentioned last night, do you think it's important?" Her question was innocent enough, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to Beatrice, as if gauging her reaction. "It may be," Miss Marple replied, her tone mild. "Small things, you know, often tell us more than we expect. A broken cork, dropped in haste, might suggest someone was in the cellar for reasons other than the unveiling." She glanced at Beatrice, whose expression remained impassive, though her hands tightened briefly on the rack. Dr. Mortimer, standing a few paces away, adjusted his spectacles and peered at the shelf. A cork could break for any number of reasons, he said, his voice dry. Faulty storage, a clumsy hand. I once saw a bottle shatter from improper corking pressure builds, you see. His explanation was plausible, but Miss Marple sensed a deflection, as if he wished to steer the conversation away from the cork's significance. Victor, lingering near the edge of the group, ran his hand along a row of bottles, his movements casual but his eyes restless. This cellar's a labyrinth, he said, his tone light. A thief could slip in and out without being seen, especially during the commotion last night. His words were reasonable, but Miss Marple noticed the faint trace of mud on his shoes, now dry but unmistakably similar to the smudge in the dining room. She made no comment, her mind cataloguing the observation for later. Mrs. Gray, standing near the staircase, shifted slightly, her gloved hands clasped tightly. The cellar is secure, she said, her voice low and muffled by her veil. Lady, Beatrice said so herself. Perhaps the thief came from outside. Her suggestion echoed her remark from the previous night, and Miss Marple wondered at its repetition, as if Mrs. Gray were intent on directing suspicion away from the house. Beatrice, perhaps sensing the scrutiny, stepped forward, her voice firm. The cellar has only one entrance, and I hold the key. No one could have entered without my knowledge. Her eyes met Miss Marple's, and for a moment a silent challenge passed between them. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her expression serene but her mind alert to the possibility that Beatrice's insistence concealed more than it revealed. As the guests spread out to examine the cellar, Miss Marple moved to the far wall, where the racks gave way to bare stone. She felt a faint draught, cold and persistent, stirring the hem of her skirt. Kneeling again, she traced her fingers along the base of the wall, detecting a seam that was almost invisible in the dim light. It was a panel, cleverly concealed, its edges flush with the stone. She pressed gently, but it did not yield, and she made no further attempt, aware of the other's proximity. The discovery confirmed her suspicion. Blackthorn Manor, like many old houses, held secrets in its walls, and the cellar might well be a conduit to the dining room above. Returning to the central rack, she observed the guests' interactions. Sir Reginald, his enthusiasm for investigation waning, grumbled about the damp and retreated to the staircase, declaring the cellar a fruitless endeavour. Clara, however, was relentless, her fingers brushing the bottles as she scribbled notes, her questions to Beatrice pointed but carefully phrased. "Do you ever open these older vintages?" she asked. "I mean, before last night's unveiling. Could someone have been down here, tampering with the racks?" Beatrice's reply was sharp, almost defensive. "The cellar is my domain. No one touches the bottles without my permission." Dr. Mortimer, meanwhile, lingered near a rack of lesser vintages, his fingers tracing the labels as if reading a chemical formula. "Wine is a science," he remarked to no one in particular. "The right conditions, the right timing, all precise. A broken cork could disrupt that balance." His words were abstract, but Miss Marple sensed a deeper intent, as if he were testing the group's reactions. Victor, pacing restlessly, paused near the central rack, his eyes lingering on the 1892 bottle. "Ashamed to open such a treasure," he said, his tone almost too casual. "But I suppose it distracted us, all perfect timing for a thief." His observation was astute, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand lingered near the rack, as if drawn to something specific. She recalled the stickiness on the shelf, wondering if Victor's restless movements concealed a purpose. Mrs. Gray, still near the staircase, watched the group with an intensity that belied her reserved demeanour. When Miss Marple approached, asking if she'd noticed anything unusual the previous night, Mrs. Gray's reply was curt. "I was focused on the unveiling, like everyone else." Her veil obscured her expression, but Miss Marple sensed a guardedness that went beyond mere shyness as the group prepared to return upstairs. Miss Marple lingered, her eyes sweeping the cellar once more. The broken cork, the hidden panel, the draft door were pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a thief who knew the manor's secrets. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a similar theft had been solved by noticing a gardener's muddy boots left carelessly by a back door. Here, the clues were more elusive, but they whispered of a plan both bold and calculated, executed by someone who moved among them unseen yet ever present. Back in the dining room, Beatrice announced that the staff would conduct a thorough search of the manor, though her tone suggested little hope of success. "The silver is gone," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "but I trust we'll find answers, with Miss Marple's help." Her appeal was earnest, but Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the way her eyes avoided the side door, as if it held a truth she preferred to ignore. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple remained by the table, her fingers brushing the shallow scratch. The broken cork, now safe in her handbag, was a small but vital clue, a fragment of a moment when the thief's composure had faltered. She thought of the guests' Beatrice's calculated charm, Sir Reginald's bluster, Clara's eager curiosity, Dr. Mortimer's cryptic detachment, Victor's restless polish, and Mrs. Gray's veiled silence. Each held a piece of the truth, she felt certain, and the cellar, with its whispers of secrets, was the key to unravelling them. The morning wore on, the mist outside thickening, and Miss Marple's mind was as busy as her knitting needles, weaving connections between the clues and the players. The theft was no mere act of greed, she suspected, but a performance with a purpose yet to be revealed. And as she sipped her tea, her eyes bright with quiet determination, she knew that the broken cork, like a dropped stitch, would lead her to the pattern's heart. Chapter 5. The guests under scrutiny, the late morning at Blackthorn. Manor was cloaked in a persistent mist that clung to the moorland, softening the Gothic spires of the house and lending an air of melancholy to its ancient stones. Inside, the drawing-room was a haven of warmth, its fire crackling in the grate, the scent of wood smoke mingling with the faint perfume of dried roses in a crystal vase. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the hearth, her knitting needles clicking softly, a skein of pale blue wool resting in her lap. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly spinster, absorbed in her handiwork, but her bright eyes, darting over the rim of her spectacles, missed nothing of the guests gathered around her. The theft of the Harrow family silver had cast a shadow over the weekend, and the tension in the room was as palpable as the mist outside. Lady Beatrice Harrow stood by the window, her silhouette framed against the grey light, her black silk dress accentuating her poised but strained demeanour. She had spoken little since breakfast, her earlier distress now tempered by a quiet resolve that Miss Marple found both admirable and suspicious. Sir Reginald Voss sprawled in an armchair, his florid face set in a scowl as he leafed through a newspaper, muttering about the indignity of the theft. Clara Dunhill, perched on a settee, scribbled in her notebook, her nervous energy barely contained as she glanced at the others, as if seeking a lead for her article. Dr. Felix Mortimer leaned against the mantel, his lean fingers toying with a small bronze figurine, his expression one of detached curiosity, as if the theft were an intellectual exercise rather than a personal affront. Victor Crane paced near the door, his polished exterior fraying slightly, his dark eyes restless as they avoided the side door where the muddy footprint had been found. Mrs. Evelyn Gray, her veiled hat still in place, sat in a corner, her hands folded tightly, her silence a barrier that invited speculation. Miss Marple, her needles moving with rhythmic precision, began her inquiries with the gentle persistence of a gardener tending delicate blooms. She turned to Sir Reginald, whose bluster had dominated much of the morning's conversation. "Sir Reginald," she said, her voice soft but clear, "you spoke last night of the silver's historical value. Have you had much experience with such heirlooms? They must be a temptation to those with less scruple." Sir Reginald lowered his newspaper, his moustache twitching as he warmed to the subject. "Indeed, Miss Marple, I've valued many a collection in my time, silver, porcelain, even medieval manuscripts. The Harrow silver is exceptional, 17th century work, I'd say, with hallmarks that speak of a master craftsman, worth a fortune, but I have no need to pilfer it." He puffed out his chest, his tone indignant, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to Beatrice, as if seeking confirmation of his integrity. "Besides," he added, "I was in the cellar with the rest of you, marvelling at that Lafite. No opportunity for mischief." Miss Marple nodded, her expression benign. "Of course, Sir Reginald. It's only that your expertise makes you a keen observer. Did you notice anyone lingering near the dining room before we descended to the cellar?" Her question was casual, but her gaze was sharp, catching the slight reddening of his cheeks. "Not a soul," he replied, a touch too quickly. "We were all together, weren't we? Except for the staff, of course, but Hodges swears they were in the kitchen." His deflection was smooth, but Miss Marple sensed a discomfort, as if he regretted mentioning the staff. She turned to Clara, who had paused her scribbling to listen. "Miss Dunhill, your article on Lady Beatrice's wine collection must be quite an undertaking. I imagine you've been observing everything closely. Perhaps you saw something out of the ordinary last night." Miss Marple's tone was encouraging, like an aunt inviting a confidence, but her eyes were alert for any slip. Clara flushed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I was focused on the unveiling," she said, her voice high with nervous energy. "The cellar, the wine, it's all so fascinating for my readers. But I did notice, well, it's probably nothing, but Mr. Crane stepped away for a moment during the ceremony. I thought he was just admiring the racks, but he was gone a bit longer than the rest of us." Her words tumbled out, and she glanced at Victor, her expression a mix of apology and defiance. Victor stopped pacing, his jaw tightening. "I was stretching my legs, Miss Dunhill," he said, his charm strained but intact. "That cellar's stifling, and I wanted a closer look at the vintages. I was back before the scream, as you well know." His tone was sharp, and Miss Marple noted the way his hand clenched briefly, as if suppressing a stronger reaction. Clara's cheeks reddened, but she pressed on. "I'm not accusing anyone, Mr. Crane. I'm just saying what I saw. My job is to notice things." Her defensiveness was genuine, but Miss Marple sensed an underlying ambition, as if Clara hoped the theft would elevate her article into something more than a society piece. Miss Marple turned to Dr. Mortimer, who had set the bronze figurine down, and was now watching the exchange with a faint smile. "Dr. Mortimer, you mentioned last night that thieves leave traces. Your scientific mind must have formed some theories about how the silver was taken. Any thoughts on the muddy footprint? Perhaps. Her question was gentle, but it carried a subtle challenge, inviting him to reveal more than he might intend. Dr. Mortimer adjusted his spectacles, his smile widening slightly. Footprints are unreliable, Miss Marple. Mud can be tracked in by anyone's servants, guests, even a stray cat. As for the theft, I'd wager it was planned, not impulsive. The timing during the unveiling suggests someone who knew our movements. But I'm no detective, merely a chemist with a fondness for puzzles. His tone was light, almost mocking, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes lingered on Beatrice, as if testing her reaction. Beatrice, who had been listening silently, spoke up, her voice measured. Dr. Mortimer, I assure you, the manor is secure. The dining room was locked before dinner, and only Hodges and I have keys to the main entrances. The thief must have been an outsider, perhaps someone who slipped in during the confusion. Her insistence was firm, but Miss Marple detected a flicker of unease, as if Beatrice were more concerned with controlling the narrative than solving the crime. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mrs. Gray, whose veiled figure seemed to shrink further. Into the corner. Mrs. Gray, you've been very quiet, she said, her tone kindly but probing. As a family connection, you must know Blackthorn Manor well. Did you notice anything unusual last night, perhaps before we went to the cellar? Her question was direct, designed to draw out the elusive guest. Mrs. Gray's hands tightened, her voice low and muffled by the veil. I know little of the manor's workings, she said. I came at Beatrice's invitation to discuss a family matter, nothing more. I was in the cellar with everyone else, focused on the wine. Her reply was clipped, almost rehearsed, and Miss Marple's instincts prickled. The veil, she thought, was more than a fashion choice, was a shield, concealing more than just a face. As the conversation lulled, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the broken cork, still tucked in her handbag. Its presence in the cellar, marked with a 1920 vintage, suggested someone had tampered with a bottle unrelated to the unveiling. Perhaps as a distraction or an accident in the thief's haste. She recalled the faint stickiness on the rack, the draft from the hidden panel, and the muddy footprint upstairs, each clue a thread in a pattern that was slowly taking shape. The guests, she felt certain, held the key, their motives and movements interwoven with the manor's secrets. The fire crackled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and Miss Marple seized the moment to steer the conversation further. It's curious, she said, her voice thoughtful, how a theft of this nature requires not just opportunity but knowledge. The silver was heavy, yet no one heard a sound, save for Mr. Hodges' report of a clatter, and that footprint so abruptly suggests a thief who knew how to vanish. She paused, her eyes moving from face to face, noting Sir Reginald's scowl, Clara's eager nod, Dr. Mortimer's raised eyebrow, Victor's tense stillness, and Mrs. Gray's subtle shift in posture. Victor, perhaps feeling the weight of her gaze, spoke up, his tone forcefully casual. You're right, Miss Marple. It's almost as if the thief planned every step. But we were all accounted for, weren't we? Unless someone slipped away unnoticed. His eyes flicked to Clara, a subtle retaliation for her earlier comment. But Miss Marple caught the way his fingers brushed his cufflinks, a nervous habit that betrayed his unease. Beatrice, sensing the rising tension, interjected. Enough speculation, she said, her voice sharp. The staff are searching the manor, and I've sent for a locksmith to secure the dining room. We'll find the silver, or at least discover how it was taken. Her words were resolute, but Miss Marple noted the way her hand lingered on the window latch, as if she longed to escape the room's scrutiny. The conversation turned to practical matters, where the staff should search, whether the garden path warranted another look, but Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, piecing together the guests' behaviours. Sir Reginald's boastful expertise suggested a man who craved attention, perhaps enough to exaggerate his role in the drama. Clara's eagerness hinted at ambition, but also a potential recklessness that might have led her to snoop where she shouldn't. Dr. Mortimer's detachment masked a keen intellect, one that might see more than he admitted. Victor's restlessness and muddy shoes pointed to a man with something to hide, though whether it was guilt or fear remained unclear. And Mrs. Grey, her silence, her veil, her vague claims of family ties, suggested a deeper connection to the manor, one that Beatrice herself seemed reluctant to clarify as the guests rose to disperse. Beatrice announced a plan to explore the manor's grounds, hoping to find traces of the thief's escape. "The moor is treacherous," she said, "but it may hold clues we've missed." The others agreed, though Sir Reginald grumbled about the damp, and Mrs. Grey excused herself, claiming a headache. Miss Marple, however, declined to join the search, citing her age and a preference for the fire's warmth. In truth, she wished to remain behind, to observe the manor in the quiet that followed the guests' departure, alone in the drawing-room. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and moved to the side door, where the muddy footprint had been found. The smudge was still visible, its edges now dry and crumbling. She knelt, her fingers tracing the carpet, and confirmed her earlier suspicion. The mud was from the moor, rich and loamy, but its abrupt end suggested a deliberate act, perhaps a cloth used to wipe away further tracks. She thought of the cellar's hidden panel, the draught she had felt, and the broken cork, each clue pointing to a thief who moved through the manor's unseen spaces. Returning to her chair, she retrieved the cork from her handbag, turning it over in her hands. Its jagged edges spoke of haste, a moment when the thief's careful plan faltered. She recalled Victor's muddy shoes, Clara's observation of his absence, and Mrs. Grey's guarded demeanour, each a piece of a puzzle that was not yet complete. The manor, she thought, was a stage, and the guests its players, each with a role to play in the drama of the Silver's disappearance. As the fire burned low, Miss Marple's mind was as active as ever, weaving the threads of suspicion into a pattern that would, in time, reveal the truth. Chapter 6. A disguise unravelled. The afternoon at Blackthorn Manor unfolded under a sky heavy with the threat of rain, the moorland mist curling around the Gothic spires like a living thing. Inside, the library was a sanctuary of hushed tones and old leather, its tall shelves groaning under the weight of dusty tomes and family records. Miss Jane Marple sat in a deep armchair by a leaded window, her knitting needles idle in her lap, her eyes fixed on a photograph album she had found tucked among the shelves. The album, bound in faded burgundy leather, chronicled the Harrow family's history, its pages filled with sepia-toned images of stiff-collared ancestors and grand occasions. Yet it was a more recent photograph, slipped loosely between the pages, that held her attention, a snapshot from a charity ball, showing Lady Beatrice Harrow in a sapphire-starred brooch that gleamed against her gown. Miss Marple's thoughts were as intricate as the lace shawl draped over her shoulders, weaving together the clues that had emerged since the theft of the Harrow family silver, the muddy footprint vanishing at the dining-room's side door, the shallow scratch on the table, the broken cork in the wine cellar, marked with a 1920 vintage. The faint draught from a hidden panel pointed to a thief who moved with the intimacy of a shadow through the manor's secrets. Yet it was the guests themselves, their guarded glances and half-spoken truths, that formed the heart of the puzzle. And now the brooch in the photograph stirred a new suspicion, one that cast a sharp light on the enigmatic Mrs. Evelyn Grey. The morning's inquiries had revealed much about the guests' temperaments: Sir Reginald Voss's bluster, Clara Dunhill's ambition, Dr. Felix Mortimer's cryptic detachment, Victor Crane's restless unease, and Mrs. Grey's veiled reticence, but little about their motives. Miss Marple had noted the sapphire-starred brooch on Mrs. Grey's shawl during dinner, half-hidden but unmistakable, identical to the one Beatrice wore in the photograph. The coincidence was too precise to ignore, and Miss Marple's mind, honed by years of observing human nature in St. Mary Mead, began to trace a possibility as bold as it was unsettling. Could Mrs. Grey be Beatrice herself, cloaked in disguise, to play a part in the theft? The library door creaked open, admitting Clara Dunhill, her cheeks flushed from the damp air outside. The guests had returned from their fruitless search of the grounds, their boots caked with moorland mud, their tempers frayed by the lack of progress. Clara clutched her notebook, her eyes bright with a mix of frustration and excitement. "Miss Marple," she said, sinking into a chair opposite, "the moor's a maze, nothing but heather and bog. No sign of the silver, not even a footprint. But I overheard something curious just now, and I thought you'd want to know." Miss Marple set the album aside, her expression attentive but unhurried. "Do tell, Miss Dunhill. In a house like this, even whispers can carry weight." Her voice was gentle, encouraging, but her eyes were sharp. Noting Clara's nervous habit of twisting her scarf, Clara leaned forward, her voice low. "I was in the hall, putting my coat away, when I heard Victor Crane and Beatrice talking in the drawing room. They didn't know I was there. Victor said something about a plan gone wrong, and Beatrice hushed him, sounding almost angry. I couldn't catch more. They moved away, but it felt secretive, like they were hiding something." Her words tumbled out, and she glanced at the door. As if fearing interruption, Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft clicking, a rhythm that steadied her thoughts. "A plan gone wrong," she murmured. "That is intriguing, indeed. Did Mr. Crane seem agitated, or was he his usual self?" Her question was casual, but it probed for nuance, seeking to gauge Victor's state of mind. Clara frowned, considering. He sounded tense, not like his charming act at dinner. Beatrice was sharper, though she cut him off, like she didn't want him to say more. "I thought it might be about the theft, but why would they whisper like that, unless—" She trailed off, her eyes widening as if the implication had just struck her. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. Victor's muddy shoes, his brief absence during the cellar unveiling, and now this whispered exchange suggested a man entangled in something deeper than he let on. And Beatrice's reaction hinted at complicity or control. Yet the brooch and Mrs. Grey's elusive presence tugged at Miss Marple's thoughts, urging her to test her suspicion before drawing conclusions. The library grew quiet, save for the distant patter of rain against the windows. Miss Marple glanced at the photograph again, her fingers brushing the sapphire-starred brooch in the image. "Miss Dunhill," she said, her tone thoughtful, "you have a journalist's eye for detail. Have you noticed anything unusual about Mrs. Grey? Her manner, perhaps, or something she's worn?" Her question was delicate, designed to elicit observation without revealing her own suspicions. Clara's brow furrowed. She's so quiet, it's hard to notice much. That Velshi never takes it off, even at dinner. It's odd, like she's hiding something. But I did see a brooch on her shawl last night. A shiny one with a star shape. I thought it was pretty, but it seemed out of place with her drab clothes. Her observation was keen, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained unchanged. Very observant, Miss Marple said, her voice warm. Such details can be telling, can't they? Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll take a turn about the house. Old bones need movement, you know. She rose, tucking the album under her arm, her mind already mapping her next steps. Clara's overheard conversation and the brooch's recurrence were threads that needed pulling, and the manor's quiet corners might yield more than the Moorhead dot. As Clara returned to her notebook, Miss Marple slipped into the hall, her footsteps soft. On the polished floor, the manor was a labyrinth of shadows, its corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her. She paused by a console table where a guest book lay open, its pages filled with signatures from past visitors. Mrs. Gray's entry was a mere scrawl, the ink smudged as if written in haste, and Miss Marple noted its Brevitino address, no flourish, unlike the others. It was another small anomaly, reinforcing her sense that Mrs. Gray was more than she seemed. Her destination was the morning room, where Beatrice had retreated after the ground search, claiming a need to review household accounts. Miss Marple knocked lightly, entering at Beatrice's brisk come in. The room was bright, its walls papered in pale green, but the atmosphere was heavy. Beatrice's desk strewn with ledgers that suggested financial strain rather than prosperity. Beatrice looked up, her expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Miss Marple," she said, closing a ledger with a snap. "I thought you were resting. Is there something I can do for you?" Miss Marple smiled, her demeanour as unthreatening as a village gossip. "Only a small matter, my dear. I was admiring your photograph in the library from the charity ball, I believe. That brooch you wore, the sapphire star, was quite striking. Do you wear it often?" Her question was innocent, but her eyes were keen, watching for any flicker of unease. Beatrice's hand paused, her fingers brushing the edge of the ledger. "The brooch, oh, it's a family piece, worn for special occasions. I haven't had it out in ages." Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her lips, as if the question had touched a nerve. "How lovely," Miss Marple said, her tone unchanged. "I thought I saw something similar on Mrs. Gray last night, but perhaps it was the light playing tricks. Such coincidences are curious, aren't they?" She let the words hang, her gaze steady but gentle, inviting a response. Beatrice's eyes narrowed briefly, then softened into a smile. "Mrs. Gray, I doubt it. Her tastes are simpler, but I'll ask her, if you like. She's rather private." As you've no doubt noticed, her offer was polite, but Miss Marple sensed a deflection, as if Beatrice wished to steer the conversation elsewhere. "No need, my dear," Miss Marple said, waving a hand. "Just an old woman's fancy. I'll leave you to your accounts." She withdrew, her mind buzzing with the exchange. Beatrice's dismissal of the brooch was too quick, too practiced, and it strengthened Miss Marple's suspicion that Mrs. Gray's identity was a carefully guarded secret. As she returned to the hall, she encountered Victor Crane, his coat damp from the moor, his expression preoccupied. He started at the sight of her, his charm flickering back into place like a switch. "Miss Marple," he said, his smile tight, "not joining the hunt outside. The moor's a beast today. I prefer the warmth, Mr. Crane," Miss Marple replied, her tone genial. "But I wondered, did you find anything of interest out there? You seem a man who notices details." Her compliment was subtle, designed to draw him out, and she watched his reaction closely. Victor's smile faltered, his hand brushing his cufflinks. "Sir." Nervous tick, Miss Marple had noted before. "Nothing but mud and wind," he said, his voice light but strained. "The thief's long gone, I'd wager, probably halfway to London with the silver by now." His attempt at levity fell flat, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his shoes, where traces of dried mud still clung, matching the smudge in the dining room. "Perhaps," she said, her tone non-committal, "though thieves often stay closer than we think, don't they?" She let the words linger, her gaze mild but piercing, and Victor's jaw tightened before he excused himself, claiming a need to change. Miss Marple moved to the drawing room, where the other guests had gathered, their voices a low hum against the rain's patter. Sir Reginald was expounding on the virtues of antique silver to Dr. Mortimer, who listened with a sardonic smile while Clara scribbled notes, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting a revelation. Mrs. Gray sat apart, her veiled figure as still as a statue, her hands clasped in her lap. Miss Marple approached, her steps deliberate, and took a seat nearby, her knitting resuming its soft rhythm. "Mrs. Gray," she said, her voice warm, "you must find all this excitement quite taxing. I hope you're managing to rest, with so much upheaval." Her words were kind, but her intent was to probe, to see if the veiled guest would reveal anything under gentle pressure. Mrs. Gray's head turned slightly, her voice low and flat. "I manage, Miss Marple. I prefer quiet, but Beatrice insisted I come. Family matters, you understand." Her reply was as vague as ever, but Miss Marple noted the way her hands tightened, as if the mention of family stirred unease. "Of course," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "Family is so important, isn't it? I noticed a lovely brooch on your shawl last night, star, I think. It reminded me of one Lady Beatrice owns. A family heirloom, perhaps." Her question was direct, yet cloaked in the guise of idle chatter, and she watched Mrs. Gray's reaction closely. The veiled figure stiffened, her hands pausing. "A brooch," she said, her voice barely audible. "You must be mistaken. I wear no such thing." Her denial was swift, but Miss Marple caught the faint tremor in her tone, a crack in the facade that confirmed her suspicions. Before she could press further, the door opened, and Beatrice entered, her expression composed, but her eyes sharp. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Gray," she said, her voice bright but strained. "I hope you're comfortable. I've arranged for tea in the Her invitation was abrupt, as if she sensed the tension and wished to interrupt it. The group moved to the conservatory, a glass-walled room filled with ferns and the scent of damp earth. As tea was served, Miss Marple's mind was busy, piecing together the brooch, Clara's overheard conversation, and Victor's muddy shoes. The sapphire-starred brooch, worn by both Beatrice and Mrs. Gray, was no coincidence. It was a clue to a disguise, a bold masquerade that suggested Beatrice herself had played a dual role. But why? To stage the theft, perhaps, or to manipulate the guests' perceptions. And Victor's whispered talk of a plan gone wrong hinted at complicity, though his unease suggested he was a reluctant participant. As the rain drummed on the glass, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes moving from Beatrice's controlled smile to Mrs. Gray's veiled silence, from Victor's restless fingers to Clara's eager glances. The disguise was unraveling, she felt certain, But the motive remained hidden, a secret as deep as the manor's wine cellar. And as she set her cup down, her mind as sharp as ever, she knew that the next act of this drama would bring the truth closer to the light. Chapter 7. The footprints to nowhere. The afternoon at Blackthorn Manor wore on under a sky that refused to clear. The moorland mist weaving a dense curtain around the house, muffling the world beyond its Gothic walls. Inside, the air was thick, with the scent of damp wool and old wood, the manor's corridors a maze of shadows that seemed to hold their breath. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, stood alone in the dining room, her eyes fixed on the muddy footprint near the side door. The smudge, now dry and flaking, was a silent witness to the theft of the Harrow family silver, its abrupt end at the threshold a puzzle that gnawed at her orderly mind. The clues: a broken cork in the wine cellar, the sapphire-starred brooch, shared by Beatrice and Mrs. Gray, the whispered talk of a plan gone wrong, were threads in a tapestry she was determined to unravel. And the footprint, she felt certain, was a stitch that could lead her to the pattern's heart. The dining room was quiet, the guests having scattered after tea in the conservatory, their nerves frayed by the theft and the fruitless search of the moor. Lady Beatrice Harrow had retreated to her study, claiming a need to correspond with her solicitor, though Miss Marple suspected the task was a pretext to avoid further questions. Sir Reginald Voss was in the billiard-room, his booming voice audible, even through closed doors, as he recounted tales of antique auctions to Dr. Felix Mortimer, who listened with his usual sardonic detachment. Clara Dunhill had slipped away to her room, no doubt to refine her notes for the article that grew more sensational with each passing hour. Victor Crane, his polished charm wearing thin, had excused himself to freshen up, though Miss Marple had noted the restless flicker in his eyes as he left. Mrs. Evelyn Gray, her veiled presence as elusive as ever, had declined to join the others, citing fatigue, and Miss Marple's suspicion that she was Beatrice in disguise grew stronger with each guarded interaction. Miss Marple knelt by the side door, her movements careful despite the stiffness of age, her fingers brushing the carpet where the footprint lay. The mud was unmistakably from the moor, its rich, loamy texture distinct from the garden's gravel path. The print was broad, suggesting a man's shoe, but its edges were smudged, as if deliberately blurred. The trail led to the door, but stopped abruptly, as if the thief had stepped into thin air. She opened the door, letting in a gust of damp air that carried the scent of heather and peat. The path outside was undisturbed, the gravel smooth, the surrounding earth free of further prints. Yet her sharp eyes caught a faint irregularity, a scrape on the doorframe, low and narrow, as if something heavy had grazed it in passing. It was not unlike the scratch on the dining table, suggesting a burden hurriedly moved. Most curious, Miss Marple murmured, closing the door and turning back to the room. The absence of further footprints suggested a deliberate act, perhaps a cloth used to wipe away tracks or a route that bypassed the obvious path. She thought of the hidden panel in the wine cellar. It seemed barely visible in the stone, and the draught that had stirred her skirt. Old houses like Blackthorn Manor were riddled with such secret passages for servants, priests, or smuggler sand. She suspected the thief had used one to move unseen. Her gaze shifted to the garden beyond the window, where a rosebush stood near the path, its thorns sharp against the mist. She stepped outside, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel, and examined the ground. The earth beneath the rosebush was disturbed, the soil slightly mounded, as if recently turned. She knelt again, her fingers probing gently, but found only loose dirt, no trace of the silver. The disturbance was fresh, though, and she wondered if it was a diversion, meant to draw attention from the true hiding place. The thief, she reasoned, had planned their escape with care. Yet the muddy footprint and the broken cork suggested moments of haste that betrayed their precision. Returning to the dining room, Miss Marple considered the guests' movements during the theft. They had all been in the cellar for the unveiling of the 1892 Chateau Lafite, a moment orchestrated by Beatrice with theatrical flair. Yet Victor had slipped away briefly, as Clara had noted, and Mrs. Gray's reticence made her an enigma whose presence or absence was hard to verify. Beatrice's insistence on the cellar's security, coupled with her quick dismissal of the brooch's significance, hinted at a deeper role in the drama. Miss Marple's mind turned to the whispered conversation Clara had overheard. Victor's mention of a plan gone wrong and Beatrice's sharp rebuke. It suggested complicity, but also conflict. As if the plan had veered off course, she moved to the table, where the shallow scratch remained, a faint scar in the polished wood. It was near the edge, closest to the side door, and she pictured the silver being dragged rather than lifted, perhaps bundled in a cloth to muffle the sound. Hodges had reported a clatter, a single noise that had drawn him to the dining room, but the theft itself had been silent, a feat requiring both speed and familiarity with the house. The footprint, the scratch, the cork all pointed to a thief. Who knew the manor's hidden paths, yet the plan's flaws suggested an amateur's touch, or perhaps a deliberate misstep to mislead. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the creak of the door, and Mr. Hodges entered, his face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," he said, bowing slightly, "Lady Beatrice asked me to check on you. The staff have searched the upper floors, but there's no sign of the silver. I thought you might wish to know." His voice was steady, but his hands twisted together, betraying his unease. "Thank you, Mr. Hodges," Miss Marple replied, her tone kind but probing. "You've been most diligent. Tell me, when you heard the clatter last night, did you notice anything else? Perhaps a shadow, a movement?" In the hall, her question was gentle, but her eyes were sharp. Watching for any flicker of hesitation, Hodges shook his head, his brow furrowing. "Nothing, madam. The hall was dark, and I was in the kitchen with the staff. The clatter came from the dining room, and when I arrived, the silver was gone. I checked the doors and windows all locked, except this one." He gestured to the side door, his expression troubled. "It's as if the thief vanished, like a ghost." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her mind dismissing the supernatural. "Ghosts leave no footprints, Mr. Hodges, but people do, and people make mistakes. Did you happen to notice anyone near the dining room earlier in the evening, perhaps before dinner?" Her question was casual, but it sought to test the butler's memory. Hodges hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor. "I was busy with preparations, madame, but I recall seeing Mr. Crane in the hall before we went to the cellar. He said he was fetching a handkerchief from his room, and Mrs. Gracie passed through earlier, though she said little, as usual." His voice was careful, as if he feared implicating anyone. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. Victor's presence in the hall, Mrs. Gray's fleeting appearance, both added to the web of suspicion, though neither was conclusive. "Thank you, Mr. Hodges. You've been most helpful." She dismissed him with a smile, her mind already turning to the cellar, where the broken cork had been found. She made her way downstairs. The spiral staircase cooled under her hand, the air growing heavier with the scent of earth and oak. The wine cellar was as she had left it, its racks stretching into the shadows, the chandelier unlit in the dim afternoon light. She moved to the rack where the broken cork had been, its absence now a silent clue in her handbag. The shelf was slightly askew, and she ran her fingers along its edge, feeling the faint stickiness she had noted before. It was wine, she was certain, spilled in haste. Perhaps when the cork was broken. She examined the nearby bottles, all from the 1920s, their labels pristine but for one, slightly smudged as if recently handled. Her attention shifted to the hidden panel she had discovered, its seam almost invisible in the stone wall. She pressed gently, feeling the faint give of a mechanism, but it did not open. Kneeling, she traced the floor, finding a thin groove that suggested a trap door or passage. The draft was stronger here, cold and persistent, and she pictured a narrow tunnel leading upward, perhaps to the dining room or another part of the manor. Such passages were common in houses of this age, built for secrecy or escape, and she suspected the thief had used it to move the silver unseen. As she rose, she heard footsteps on the staircase, and Victor Crane appeared, his coat still damp from the moor. His eyes widened at the sight of her, but he recovered quickly, his smile flashing. "Miss Marple, playing detective again," he said, his tone light but strained. "This cellar's a gloomy place to be alone. I find it quite illuminating." Miss Marple replied, her voice mild. "The quiet helps one think, don't you agree? I was wondering about that cork we found, such a small thing, yet out of place. Did you notice anyone near this rack last night, perhaps handling a bottle?" Her question was gentle, but her gaze was steady, watching for any sign of unease. Victor's smile faltered, his hand brushing his cufflinks. "I was too busy admiring the Lafitte," he said, his voice smooth but his eyes darting to the rack. People were milling about hard to keep track. "Why do you think the cork's important?" His curiosity seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his posture, as if he feared where her questions might lead. "Small things often are," she said, her tone non-committal, "like footprints that vanish, or plans that go awry." She let the words hang, her eyes meeting his, and saw a flicker of alarm before he excused himself, claiming a need to join the others. Alone again, Miss Marple returned to the panel, her mind racing. The footprints to nowhere, the broken cork, the hidden passage, all pointed to a thief who knew the manor's secrets. Yet the plan's flaws suggested a moment of panic or miscalculation. She thought of Beatrice, her theatrical distress, and Mrs. Gray, whose veiled presence seemed a deliberate mask. Victor's whispered conversation with Beatrice, overheard by Clara, hinted at a scheme that had faltered, and the sapphire-starred brooch tied Beatrice to Mrs. Gray in a way that could not be coincidence. As she ascended to the drawing room, where the guests were gathering for tea, Miss Marple's thoughts were as busy as her knitting needles. The footprints to nowhere were a ruse, she felt certain, designed to mislead, just as the broken cork was a slip in an otherwise careful plan. The manor's secrets were unraveling, and the guests, with their guarded glances and half-truths, were the key to the truth. She settled into her chair, her needles resuming their rhythm, her eyes bright with the certainty that the next clue would bring her closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 8. The Heiress's motive. The evening at Blackthorn Manor descended with a quiet that seemed to deepen the shadows, the moorland mist pressing against the windows like a silent conspirator. The drawing room, aglow with the soft light of oil lamps, was a haven of warmth against the chill outside, its heavy drapes drawn to keep the night at bay. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual armchair by the fire, her knitting needles still, her hands folded over the pale blue wool in her lap. The theft of the Harrow family silver hung over the house like a spectre, and the guests, gathered for an impromptu séance proposed by Lady Beatrice Harrow, wore expressions of unease, their faces flickering in the lamplight like figures in a half-remembered dream. Beatrice stood at the centre of the room, her black silk dress catching the light, her auburn hair swept into a severe chignon that accentuated her pale, determined features. "My friends," she said, her voice resonant but tinged with a theatrical tremor, "the loss of the silver has shaken us all, but Blackthorn Manor has its secrets, and perhaps its spirits can guide us to the truth." She gestured to a round table draped in velvet, where candles flickered in a silver holder, one of the few pieces not stolen. "A séance, I believe, may offer answers where our searches have failed." Her eyes swept the room, lingering on. Each guest, and Miss Marple, watching closely, noted a flicker of calculation, as if the séance were less about spirits and more about control. Sir Reginald Voss, seated heavily in a chair, snorted derisively, his moustache bristling. "Poppycock," he muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Spirits don't steal silver, and I'd rather trust a constable than a Ouija board." Yet he remained, his curiosity or perhaps his desire to stay in Beatrice's good graces overriding his skepticism. Clara Dunhill, her notebook tucked away but her eyes alight with journalistic fervour, leaned forward, clearly eager for any development that might fuel her article. Dr. Felix Mortimer, his lean frame slouched against the mantel, offered a sardonic smile, his fingers toying with a pocket watch as if timing the absurdity of the proceedings. Victor Crane, his charm frayed by the day's tensions, sat rigidly, his gaze darting to the door as if he longed to escape. Mrs. Evelyn Grey, her veiled hat casting shadows across her face, sat at the table's edge, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles showed white through her gloves. Miss Marple, her demeanour as serene as a village vicar's, joined the circle, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. She had little faith in séances, having seen too many parlour tricks in St. Mary Mead, but she recognized their value as a stage for human nature to reveal itself. Beatrice's proposal, she suspected, was less about communing with spirits and more about testing the guests or perhaps deflecting their suspicions. The sapphire-starred brooch, seen on both Beatrice and Mrs. Grey, and Clara's overheard whisper of a plan gone wrong between Beatrice and Victor, had solidified Miss Marple's theory. Mrs. Grey was Beatrice in disguise, and the theft was a carefully staged act with a motive yet to be uncovered. The séance began with Beatrice dimming the lamps, the room sinking into a twilight of candlelight and shadow. She placed her hands on the table, inviting the others to do the same, her voice low and commanding. "We call upon the spirits of Blackthorn Manor," she intoned, "to reveal who has taken the Harrow silver." Her words were solemn, but Miss Marple noted the slight theatricality, as if Beatrice were playing a role she had rehearsed. The group joined hands, the air thick with anticipation and unease. Sir Reginald's grumbling subsided, replaced by a wary silence, while Clara's breathing quickened, her eyes darting to Beatrice. Dr. Mortimer's smile remained, but his fingers tightened on the table, betraying a flicker of tension. Victor's hand, next to Miss Marple's, was clammy, his usual polish eroded by the day's scrutiny. Mrs. Grey, her veil trembling slightly, kept her hands rigid, as if resisting the ritual's intimacy. For several moments, silence reigned, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. Then a faint tapping sounded, so soft it might have been the house settling. Clara gasped, her eyes wide, while Sir Reginald muttered about draughts. Beatrice's voice rose, steady but insistent. "Spirits, speak to us. Where is the silver hidden?" The tapping grew louder, rhythmic, and Miss Marple's keen ears traced it to the table's edge. Near Mrs. Gray. A subtle movement, perhaps a foot nudging the wood, but before she could confirm it, Mrs. Gray's veil slipped, revealing a glimpse of auburn hair and a sharp jawline unmistakably Beatrice's. A collective gasp broke the circle, hands falling from the table. Clara's voice rang out, sharp with shock. "Lady Beatrice, you're Mrs. Gray." The room erupted in murmurs, Sir Reginald's face reddening with indignation, Dr. Mortimer's smile widening with amusement, and Victor's jaw tightening, as if he had expected this, but dreaded its exposure. Beatrice, her composure faltering, laughed a high, brittle sound that cut through the tension. "Oh, my dear Clara, what a notion," she said, adjusting the veil with a trembling hand. "I thought a disguise might lighten the mood, test your loyalty to the manor. A harmless jest, nothing more." Her explanation was smooth, but her eyes darted to Miss Marple, seeking her reaction, and found only a serene gaze that revealed nothing. Miss Marple, her hands folded calmly, spoke softly. "A jest, Lady Beatrice. How very bold, but disguises, you know, often conceal more than they reveal. Might I ask why you felt the need to play such a part?" Her question was gentle, but it carried a weight that silenced the room, all eyes. Turning to Beatrice, Beatrice's smile wavered, her fingers twisting the edge of the veil. "I meant only to observe," she said, her voice less certain. "With the silver stolen, I thought, perhaps one of you might reveal something if you didn't know I was watching." Her words were plausible, but Miss Marple noted the strain in her posture, the way her eyes avoided Victor, who sat frozen, his face pale. Dr. Mortimer leaned forward, his voice dry. "A clever ruse, Lady Beatrice, but risky. Disguises can backfire, especially when trust is already thin." His tone was almost teasing, but his eyes were sharp, as if he saw through her excuse to a deeper truth. Clara, her journalistic instincts overriding her shock, pressed further. "But why Mrs. Gray? Why invent a cousin? It's almost as if you wanted to be someone else entirely." Her question was bold, and Miss Marple admired her tenacity, though she suspected Clara's eagerness was as much for her article as for the truth. Beatrice's lips tightened, but before she could respond, Victor spoke, his voice low and strained. "Enough of this," he said, rising abruptly. "The silver's gone, and we're playing parlour games. I need air." He strode to the door, his steps unsteady, and Miss Marple noted the faint trace of mud on his shoes, a reminder of the footprint. In the dining room, as the group dispersed, the séance abandoned, Miss Marple lingered, her mind racing. Beatrice's disguise, confirmed by the slipped veil, was no mere jest, was a calculated move, perhaps to orchestrate the theft, or to manipulate the guests' perceptions. The sapphire-starred brooch, seen on both Beatrice and Mrs. Gray, was a deliberate clue, one that Beatrice had underestimated, assuming it would go unnoticed. Clara's overheard conversation, Victor's mention of a plan gone wrong, and his nervous demeanour suggested he was entangled in Beatrice's scheme, perhaps reluctantly. The muddy footprint, the broken cork, the hidden panel in the cellar all pointed to a theft staged with precision but marred by small errors, as if the plan had been rushed or betrayed. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her bag, and made her way to the library, seeking the quiet to think. The room was dim, its shelves looming like silent witnesses, and she settled by the window, the photograph album open before her. The charity ball snapshot, with Beatrice's sapphire-starred brooch, was a silent accusation, tying her to Mrs. Gray beyond doubt. But why the disguise? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Beatrice's financial troubles, whispered about incent, Mary Mead debts mounting, the manor's upkeep a burden, the silver a tempting asset. A staged theft, followed by a miraculous recovery, could garner sympathy, perhaps even an insurance payout, bolstering Beatrice's fragile position. Yet the plan had flossed the broken cork, dropped in haste. The footprint, left to mislead. Victor's whispered admission of failure. Miss Marple recalled a similar scheme in St. Mary Mead, where young Mrs. Hartley had hidden her own jewellery to claim insurance, only to be undone by a careless receipt left in a drawer. Here, the stakes were higher, the players more complex, but the human folly was the same: greed, pride, and the belief that one could outwit fate. She closed the album, her mind turning to the cellar's hidden panel. The draft she had felt, the groove in the floor, suggested a passage leading to the dining room, a route the thief Beatrice, perhaps, as Mrs. Gray had used to move the silver unseen. The footprint was a red herring, meant to suggest an outsider. But the cork, the scratch on the table, and Victor's unease pointed to an inside job, orchestrated by someone who knew the manor's secrets. As she prepared to join the others for dinner, Miss Marple paused by the dining room, where the absence of the silver was a silent reproach. The muddy footprint, now a faint smudge, and the scratched table were clues to a drama that was reaching its climax. Beatrice's motive, she felt certain, was tied to her pride and her precarious finances, but the execution required an accomplice perhaps, whose muddy shoes and nervous demeanour suggested a man caught in a web not entirely of his making. At dinner, the mood was strained, Beatrice's attempt at levity falling flat. She spoke of the manor's history, of ancestors who had weathered wars and scandals, but her eyes darted to Miss Marple, as if sensing the net tightening. Victor ate little, his charm replaced by a brooding silence. While Clara's questions grew bolder, her pen poised over her notebook, Dr. Mortimer watched with his usual detachment, his comments laced with irony, and Sir Reginald grumbled about the séance, calling it a fool's errand. Mrs. Gray or Beatrice, as Miss Marple now knew, not appear. Her absence a silent confirmation of the disguise's exposure as the meal ended. Miss Marple resolved to confront Beatrice privately, to test her theory and draw out the truth. The heiress's motive was clearer, desperate bid to salvage her legacy, but the details, the how and why of the silver's hiding place, remained just out of reach. The manor's whispers, she thought, were growing louder, and the next act would bring the curtain closer to falling. Chapter 9. The muff's secret. The morning light at Blackthorn Manor was feeble, filtered through a persistent mist that cloaked the moor in a silvery veil, softening the harsh lines of the Gothic spires. Inside, the drawing-room was a cocoon of warmth, the fire in the grate casting a golden glow over the faded tapestries and polished furniture. Miss Jane Marple sat by the window, her knitting needles silent, her hands resting on the pale blue wool in her lap. The theft of the Harrow family silver had reached a turning point. The revelation of Lady Beatrice Harrow's disguise as Mrs. Evelyn Gray, unmasking a layer of deception that had set the guests whispering. Yet the silver remained missing, and Miss Marple's sharp mind, honed by years of unravelling small-town intrigues in St. Mary Mead, was piecing together the final threads of the mystery. The clues: the muddy footprint vanishing at the dining room door, the broken cork in the wine cellar, the hidden panel with its telltale draught, the sapphire-starred brooch linking Beatrice to Mrs. Gray, and Clara Dunhill's overheard whisper of a plan gone wrong between Beatrice and Victor Crane had woven a pattern that pointed to a staged theft. Miss Marple suspected Beatrice had orchestrated the disappearance to garner sympathy or secure an insurance payout. Her financial troubles, a motive whispered about in the village. The muff, a voluminous accessory Beatrice carried with an almost possessive air, had caught Miss Marple's attention during the séance, its bulk suggesting a hiding place both ingenious and overlooked. The guests were subdued at breakfast. The absence of Mrs. Greynow, known to be Beatrice in disguise, casting a pall over the meal. Beatrice, seated at the head of the table, wore a navy dress that lent her an air of quiet authority, but her eyes were shadowed, her smile strained as she poured tea. Sir Reginald Voss, his bluster muted by the previous night's drama, ate. His kippers in silence, his occasional glances at Beatrice tinged with suspicion. Clara Dunhill, her notebook open but untouched, watched the others with a journalist's hunger, her questions held in check but her curiosity palpable. Dr. Felix Mortimer, his lean fingers tracing the rim of his cup, offered cryptic remarks about human nature, his sardonic smile suggesting he found the unfolding mystery more amusing than alarming. Victor Crane, his charm eroded by nervous tension, pushed his plate away, his gaze fixed on the window as if seeking escape. Miss Marple, her demeanour as unassuming as ever, sipped her tea, her eyes moving from face to face. The séance had been a turning point, Beatrice's slipped veil exposing her dual role, but it had also revealed the cracks in her plan. Victor's agitation, Clara's eager scrutiny, and the absence of the silver suggested a scheme that had faltered, perhaps due to an accomplice's hesitation or an unforeseen complication. The muff, Miss Marple felt certain, was the key, a hiding place that allowed Beatrice to move the silver unnoticed, its bulk concealing the weight of goblets and candelabras. As breakfast ended, Miss Marple requested a private word with Beatrice, her tone gentle but firm. "Might we speak in the morning room, my dear? There are matters I'd like to discuss, and privacy would serve us best." Her request was polite, but her eyes held a quiet authority that brooked no refusal. Beatrice hesitated, her fingers tightening on her teacup, but she nodded. "Of course, Miss Marple. I'll join you in a moment." Her voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hand, a sign of nerves that betrayed her composed exterior. The morning room was a bright contrast to the manor's gloom, its pale green walls and tall windows letting in the muted light. Beatrice's desk was still strewn with ledgers, their pages hinting at debts that weighed heavily on the Harrow legacy. Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side, the broken cork safely tucked within. Beatrice entered, closing the door behind her, her navy dress rustling as she took a seat opposite. "What is it, Miss Marple?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Have you found something about the silver?" Miss Marple smiled, her expression serene but her gaze sharp. "I believe so, my dear. The silver's disappearance is a puzzle, but puzzles, you know, have a way of solving themselves when one looks closely at the pieces." She paused, her fingers brushing the edge of her bag. "I couldn't help but notice your muff last night during the séance. It's a fine accessory, so roomy and elegant. A perfect place, perhaps, to conceal something valuable." Beatrice's face paled, her hands clasping together in her lap. "My muff," she said, her voice catching. "It's just a fashion, Miss Marple. Surely you don't think I'd hide the silver in it?" Her laugh was brittle, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to the door, as if seeking an escape. "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that you are a clever woman, Lady Beatrice. But cleverness can lead to missteps. The silver was taken during the cellar unveiling, when we were all distracted by the Chateau Lafayette. The muddy footprint, the broken cork, the hidden panel in the cellar all suggest a plan executed with care, but not without flaws. And your disguise as Mrs. Gray, with that sapphire-starred brooch, was a bold touch, but it drew attention you hadn't anticipated." Beatrice's lips parted, but no sound came. Her hands tightened, and Miss Marple pressed on, her voice as soft as a whisper, but as unyielding as the moorland wind. "The muff, you see, is large enough to hold the silver goblets, candelabras, perhaps even the epergne bundled tightly. You could have slipped through the cellar's hidden panel, moved the silver to the dining room, and hidden it in the muff while we were entranced by the wine. The footprint was a diversion, meant to suggest an outsider, but the cork, broken in haste, was a mistake you couldn't erase." Beatrice's composure cracked, her eyes filling with tears, but she shook her head. "You're mistaken, Miss Marple. I would never steal my own silver. It's my family's legacy, all I have left." Her voice trembled, but Miss Marple saw the calculation behind her distress. A performance honed by desperation. "I understand, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "Legacy is a heavy burden, especially when funds are scarce. In St. Mary Mead, I knew a woman who hid her own jewels to claim insurance, thinking it would save her home. But secrets, you know, have a way of coming to light. The silver is still here, I believe, hidden where only you would know to look." Beatrice rose, her hands trembling as she paced to the window. "You have no proof," she said, her voice low. "This is all conjecture, Miss Marple. I played Mrs. Gray to watch my guests, to see if anyone betrayed their guilt. The silver was stolen by someone else, an outsider, perhaps, or one of the staff." Her words were firm, but her eyes betrayed her. Flickering with fear, Miss Marple stood, her small figure commanding despite its frailty. "Proof is a matter of time, Lady Beatrice. The cork, marked with a 1920 vintage, was dropped in the cellar. Not by accident, but in haste, perhaps when you tampered with a bottle to create a distraction. The panel in the cellar leads to a passage, I suspect, that connects to the dining room, and Victor Crane, your reluctant accomplice, spoke of a plan gone wrong, as Miss Dunhill overheard. He was to help, wasn't he? But something faltered, perhaps his nerve, or an unexpected interruption." Beatrice froze, her back to the window, her face as pale as the mist outside. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant patter of rain. Then, with a shudder, Beatrice sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "You're too clever, Miss Marple," she whispered. "I never meant for it to go this far. The silver, it's hidden in the muff, as you guessed, tucked in a wardrobe in my room. I thought if I staged the theft, I could claim the insurance, save the manor, my debts." Her voice broke, and genuine tears spilled down her cheeks. Miss Marple's expression softened, though her resolve remained. "I see, my dear, desperation can cloud even the sharpest mind. But you must return the silver and face the truth. Secrets, once kept, grow heavier than any debt." Her words were kind but firm, and Beatrice nodded, her shoulders sagging with defeat as they left the morning room. Miss Marple's mind was already turning to the next steps. The silver would be recovered, but Victor's role and the extent of his complicity remained unclear. Clara's ambition, Dr. Mortimer's detachment, and Sir Reginald's bluster had all played their parts, but it was Beatrice's pride and her desperate bid to preserve her legacy that had driven the drama. The muff's secret, like the broken cork, was a small flaw in a grand plan, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence, had unravelled it. At lunch, Beatrice announced that the silver would be found later that day, claiming a search had uncovered it in a forgotten cupboard. The guests, unaware of Miss Marple's confrontation, murmured their relief, though Clara's eyes narrowed, sensing a story untold. Victor avoided Miss Marple's gaze, his relief tinged with guilt, while Dr. Mortimer offered a knowing smile, as if he had suspected the truth all along. Sir Reginald, oblivious, toasted the recovery with a glass of claret, his faith in tradition restored. As the meal ended, Miss Marple slipped away to the library, her knitting resumed, her mind at peace. The silver was safe, the heiress's motive laid bare, and the manor's whispers, for now, were silenced. But she knew, as she always did, that human nature, with its tangled motives and hidden truths, would always provide another puzzle to solve. Chapter 10. The guest's secrets. The morning at Blackthorn Manor broke with a tentative sun, its rays piercing the moorland mist to cast a pale glow over the Gothic spires and ivy-clad walls. The dining room, once bereft of its silver, now bore the weight of an uneasy resolution, for Lady Beatrice Harrow had announced at lunch the previous day that the stolen heirlooms would be found in a forgotten cupboard. A claim that quelled the guests' agitation but left an undercurrent of suspicion. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her knitting bag at her side, her hands folded over a cup of tea that steamed gently in the morning light. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind the mild facade of an elderly spinster, moved from face to face, cataloguing the subtle shifts in demeanour that betrayed secrets yet unspoken. The clues: the muddy footprint vanishing at the dining room's side door, the broken cork in the wine cellar, the hidden panel with its whispering draught, the sapphire-starred brooch linking Beatrice to her disguise as Mrs. Evelyn Grey, and Clara Dunhill's overheard whisper of a plan gone wrong between Beatrice and Victor Crane had led Miss Marple to unravel Beatrice's scheme. The heiress had confessed in the morning room, her desperation to save the manor from financial ruin driving her to stage the theft, hiding the silver in her voluminous muff. Yet the puzzle was not complete, for Victor's role, Clara's ambitions, and the other guests' reactions suggested layers of complicity and concealment that Miss Marple was determined to probe. Beatrice, seated at the head of the table, wore a dove-grey dress that softened her features, her auburn hair pinned with quiet elegance. Her announcement of the silver's recovery had restored a semblance of her authority, but her eyes were shadowed, her smile brittle as she passed the marmalade. Sir Reginald Voss, his florid face less animated than usual, buttered his toast, with a vigour that suggested lingering indignation, his occasional glances at Beatrice tinged with doubt. Clara Dunhill, her notebook tucked away but her eyes alight with journalistic zeal, ate sparingly, her attention darting between the guests as if sensing a story beneath the surface. Dr. Felix Mortimer, his lean frame relaxed, but his fingers, toying with a spoon, offered cryptic remarks that danced around the truth, his sardonic smile hinting at knowledge he chose not to share. Victor Crane, his polished charm all but vanished, sat with his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on his plate, the weight of his involvement palpable in his silence. Miss Marple, her demeanour as unassuming as a village gossip, sipped her tea, her mind weaving the threads of the mystery into a coherent pattern. Beatrice's confession had confirmed the muff as the silver's hiding place, but Victor's role as an accomplice, hinted at by Clara's overheard conversation, remained murky. The broken cork, dropped in haste in the cellar, and the muddy footprint, a deliberate misdirection, suggested a plan that required cooperation. Yet Victor's unease and Beatrice's sharp rebuke in their whispered exchange pointed to a partnership strained by doubt or betrayal. The other guests, too, had their secret Clara's ambition. Dr. Mortimer's detachment, Sir Reginald's bluster, each a piece of the drama that had unfolded under Blackthorn Manor's roof. As breakfast ended, Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and suggested a gathering in the drawing-room to discuss the silver's recovery. "It would be a comfort, I think," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "to understand how this mystery was resolved, and to ensure no further shadows linger over the manor." Her words were met with reluctant nods, Beatrice's expression tightening briefly before she agreed, her role as hostess compelling her to comply. The drawing-room was a haven of warmth, its fire crackling against the morning chill, the heavy drapes parted to let in the faint sunlight. Miss Marple settled into her usual armchair, her knitting needles clicking softly as she began, her tone as calm as a Sunday sermon. "The silver's return is a relief, of course," she said, her eyes moving from face to face, "but it leaves questions unanswered. A theft so cleverly staged, with footprints that vanish and corks that break, suggests a plan with many hands. I thought it might be helpful to share what we know, to lay the matter to rest." Beatrice, standing by the fireplace, clasped her hands, her voice steady but strained. "The silver was found in a cupboard in the west wing," she said, repeating her earlier claim. "A foolish oversight, perhaps, by a servant who moved it during cleaning. I'm grateful it's safe, and I'd rather not dwell on the matter." Her words were smooth, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes avoided Victor, who sat rigid, his hands clenched in his lap. Clara, unable to contain her curiosity, leaned forward, her voice sharp. "But Lady Beatrice, that doesn't explain the footprint, or the cork in the cellar, or, well, your disguise as Mrs. Gray. Surely there's more to it." Her question was bold, and Miss Marple admired her tenacity, though she suspected Clara's interest was as much for her article as for justice. Beatrice's lips tightened, but before she could respond, Miss Marple spoke, her tone gentle but unyielding. "Miss Dunhill raises a fair point. The footprint, you see, was meant to suggest an outsider, but its abrupt end at the door tells a different story. And the cork, marked with a 1920 vintage Pats, was dropped in haste, perhaps when a bottle was tampered with to create a distraction. These are not the work of a careless servant, but of someone with a purpose." Her eyes rested on Beatrice, who paled but held her gaze. Sir Reginald, his patience wearing thin, snorted. "All this talk of corks and footprints, the silver's back, isn't it? Why stir up trouble? I say we let it lie and enjoy the rest of this blasted weekend." His bluster was predictable, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked to Beatrice, as if he sensed her discomfort but preferred to ignore it. Dr. Mortimer, his smile sharp, set his spoon down with a soft clink. "Miss Marple has a point," he said, his voice dry. "A theft like this requires planning, and planning requires motive. The silver's value is obvious, but the manor's secrets, passages, panels, perhaps even loyalties are less so. I wonder who knew enough to exploit them." His words were a challenge, and Miss Marple saw Victor flinch, his fingers brushing his cufflinks in a nervous tick. Victor, his composure fraying, spoke up, his voice low but strained. "You're all looking at me as if I'm the culprit," he said, his eyes darting to Beatrice. "I was in the cellar with everyone else, admiring the wine. Yes, I stepped away briefly. Clara saw me, but it was only to clear my head. This house is suffocating." His defense was vehement, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his gaze avoided hers. Clara, seizing the moment, turned to Victor. "But you were talking to Beatrice about a plan gone wrong," she said, her voice accusing. "I heard you in the hall, and you sounded scared. What was the plan, Mr. Crane? And why was Beatrice hushing you?" Her words cut through the room, and Miss Marple watched the reactions, Beatrice's sharp intake of breath, Victor's clenched jaw, Dr. Mortimer's raised eyebrow, and Sir Reginald's scowl. Beatrice stepped forward, her voice, "I see, Miss Dunhill, you misunderstand. Victor and I were discussing a private matter, nothing to do with the silver. I won't have my guests slandered by eavesdropping." Her tone was commanding, but Miss Marple saw the fear in her eyes, a crack in the facade she had so carefully maintained. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice soft but commanding attention. "Let us be clear," she said, her eyes sweeping the room. "The silver was not misplaced by a servant. It was hidden, deliberately, in Lady Beatrice's muff, a clever hiding place for such a bulky treasure. The footprint was a ruse, the cork a mistake, and the hidden panel in the cellar a pathway to the dining room. Lady Beatrice, in her guise as Mrs. Grey, orchestrated the theft, hoping to claim insurance or sympathy to save the manor from ruin. But she needed help, didn't she, Mr. Crane?" Her gaze settled on Victor, whose face drained of colour. Victor rose, his hands trembling. "You're wrong," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I had nothing to do with it, Beatrice. Them." His plea was desperate, and Miss Marple saw the truth in his eyes. Man caught in a scheme he regretted. His loyalty to Beatrice warring with his fear of exposure. Beatrice's composure shattered, her hands wringing together. Victor was persuaded to help, she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I offered him a share of the insurance money to keep quiet, to distract the others while I moved the silver. But he faltered, and the plan went awry. The cork broke, the footprint was too obvious. I thought I could control it, but—" Her words trailed off, and she sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Clara's eyes widened, her pen poised as if to capture every word, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice gentle but firm. "Miss Dunhill, your article will wait. The truth is enough for now. Sir Reginald, your bluster hid your innocence, but your talk of the silver's value fueled Beatrice's desperation. Dr. Mortimer, your detachment masked a keen eye, but you chose to watch rather than act. The manor's secrets are safe, and the silver is restored." Sir Reginald sputtered, his indignation genuine, while Dr. Mortimer offered a nod, his smile acknowledging her insight. Clara closed her notebook, her ambition tempered by the weight of the truth. Victor, his shoulders sagging, murmured an apology, his role as an unwilling accomplice laid bare. Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, her expression serene. "Lady Beatrice, you must make amends, perhaps by selling a few bottles from the cellar to ease your debts honestly. Secrets, you see, are heavier than silver, and truth, though painful, is lighter in the end." Her words were kind, but they carried the weight of judgment, and Beatrice nodded, her tears silent but genuine. As the guests dispersed, the drawing-room fell quiet, the fire's crackle the only sound. Miss Marple lingered, her mind at peace, but alert, knowing that the manor's whispers had been heard, and its secrets, for now, laid bare. Chapter 11. The manors whispered. The penultimate day at Blackthorn Manor dawned with a fragile clarity, the moorland mist thinning to reveal patches of pale sky that cast a tentative light over the Gothic spires and weathered stone. The air inside the manor was heavy with the residue of revelations. The return of the Harrow family, Silver, having quelled the immediate crisis, but left a lingering unease among the guests. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory, a glass-walled sanctuary filled with the green scent of ferns and the faint dampness of earth, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Her sharp eyes, hidden behind the gentle facade of an elderly spinster, surveyed the room with quiet intensity, her mind weaving the final threads of the mystery that had unfolded under the manor's ancient roof. The clues, the muddy footprint that vanished at the dining-room's side door, the broken cork marked with a 1920 vintage, the hidden panel in the wine cellar with its whispering draught, the sapphire-starred brooch tying Lady Beatrice Harrow to her disguise as Mrs. Evelyn Grey, and Clara Dunhill's overheard whisper of a plan gone wrong between Beatrice and Victor Cranehead, led Miss Marple to unravel a scheme driven by desperation. Beatrice's confession, extracted in the morning room, had confirmed her staging of the theft to secure an insurance payout, the silver hidden in her voluminous muff, Victor's reluctant complicity, Clara's journalistic ambition, and the other guests' varied reactions had painted a picture of human folly. But there were still secrets to be uncovered, small truths that lingered in the manor's whispers. The conservatory was quiet, the guests having scattered after a subdued breakfast. Beatrice, her composure restored but her eyes shadowed, had retreated to the library to write letters, her role as hostess now tinged with a quiet shame. Sir Reginald Voss, his bluster softened by the resolution of the theft, was in the billiard room, his voice carrying faintly as he challenged Dr. Felix Mortimer to a game. Clara Dunhill, her notebook brimming with notes, had taken to the garden, no doubt crafting her article into a tale of intrigue. Dr. Mortimer, his sardonic detachment, unshaken, had joined Sir Reginald, his cryptic remarks a counterpoint to the older man's boasts. Victor Crane, his charm eroded by guilt, had kept to his room, his absence a silent admission of his role in Beatrice's plan. Miss Marple, her knitting a steady rhythm, reflected on the manor's secrets. The hidden panel in the cellar, its groove suggesting a passage to the dining room, had been the thief's path, allowing Beatrice to move the silver unseen. The muddy footprint, a deliberate ruse to suggest an outsider, and the broken cork, dropped in haste, were flaws in an otherwise meticulous plan. Yet it was the manor itself, with its warren of corridors and whispered legends, that seemed to hold the final key. Miss Marple recalled a tale from St. Mary Mead, where old Mr. Grayson's house had a priest's hole used to hide stolen goods, its entrance concealed by a bookcase. Blackthorn Manor, she suspected, had its own hidden spaces, and the cellars. Draught hinted at a truth yet to be fully explored, as she set her knitting aside. The conservatory door opened, admitting Mr. Hodges, the butler, his face pale but composed. He carried a tray with a fresh pot of tea, his movements precise despite the strain of the past days. "Miss Marple," he said, setting the tray down, "I thought you might care for some tea. The house is quiet today, but there's a feeling as if it's waiting for something." His voice was low, almost confiding, and Miss Marple noted the way his hands trembled slightly, a sign of nerves he could not quite conceal. "Thank you, Mr. Hodges," she replied, her tone warm but probing. "The manor does have a way of holding its breath, doesn't it? I've heard tales of its wine cellar, whispers of secrets kept in its depths. Do you know of such stories?" Her question was gentle, inviting a confidence, and she watched his reaction closely, her eyes bright behind her spectacles. Hodges hesitated, his fingers brushing the tray. "Old houses have their legends, madame," he said, his voice careful. "The cellar's said to whisper, or so the staff claim. They say it's the ghosts of Harrow's past, guarding their wine. But I've never seen anything myself, only the bottles and the dust." His words were measured, but Miss Marple caught a flicker of unease, as if he knew more than he wished to share. "Whispers can be telling," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "Like the draught I felt in the cellar, near that hidden panel. It suggests a passage, perhaps to the dining room. Did you ever hear of such a thing in your years here?" Her question was direct, but cloaked in the guise of idle curiosity, and she watched as Hodges' eyes widened briefly before he composed himself. "A passage," he said, his voice steady but his hands tightening on the tray. "There are stories, madame, of tunnels built in the old days for smuggling, some say, or to hide from raiders. But I've never seen one. The cellar's locked tight, and only Lady Beatrice has the key." His reply was plausible, but Miss Marple sensed a reticence, as if he feared betraying a secret long kept. She smiled, her expression serene. "Of course, Mr. Hodges. Old houses do love their secrets, don't they? Thank you for the tea." She dismissed him gently, her mind cataloguing his words. The cellar's whispers, the draught, the passage, these were not mere legends but clues to the manor's hidden heart, and Hodges' unease suggested he knew more than he admitted. Perhaps out of loyalty to Beatrice. As Hodges left, Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and made her way to the cellar, determined to explore the hidden panel further. The spiral staircase was cool under her hand, the air growing heavier with the scent of oak and earth as she descended. The cellar was as she had left it, its racks of bottles gleaming faintly in the dim light filtering through a high window. She moved to the spot where the broken cork had been found, near the 1920 vintage rack, and then to the hidden panel. It seemed almost invisible in the stone wall. Kneeling, she traced the groove in the floor, feeling the faint give of a mechanism. With a gentle push, the panel clicked, sliding open to reveal a narrow passage, its walls damp and its air thick with the must of centuries. Miss Marple did not enter, aware of her limitations, but she peered inside, noting the faint scuff marks on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged through. The passage sloped upward, likely toward the dining room, confirming her suspicion that Beatrice had used it to move the silver unseen. The draught was stronger now, carrying a chill that spoke of hidden spaces deep within the manor's bones. She closed the panel, its mechanism clicking softly, and stood, her mind racing with the implications. The passage was the key to the theft, but it also hinted at the manor's deeper secrets that Hodges, and perhaps others, were reluctant to reveal. Returning upstairs, Miss Marple found the guests gathered in the drawing room, their conversation stilted but tinged with relief at the silver's return. Beatrice, her composure restored, spoke of plans to catalogue the wine cellar, her voice bright but her eyes wary as they met Miss Marple's. Sir Reginald, his bluster returning, recounted a tale of a stolen chalice he had once valued, his pride in his expertise undimmed. Clara, her notebook open, scribbled notes. her questions carefully phrased to avoid Beatrice's ire. Dr. Mortimer, his sardonic smile in place, listened with detached amusement, his fingers toying with a pocket watch. Victor, his guilt a silent wait, spoke little, his eyes fixed on the fire. Miss Marple settled into her armchair, her knitting resuming its rhythm, and spoke, her voice soft but commanding attention. "The silver's return is a comfort," she said, her eyes sweeping the room, "but it leaves us with lessons to learn. The manor's whispers, as Mr. Hodges called them, are not of ghosts, but of human choices, pride, desperation, loyalty. Lady Beatrice, your plan was clever, but it faltered, as such plans often do. On the small things a broken cork, a misplaced footprint, a brooch too distinctive to hide." Beatrice's face paled, but she nodded, her voice low. "I was wrong, Miss Marple. I thought I could save the manor, but I see now that honesty is the better path. I'll sell some of the wine, as you suggested, to settle my debts." Her admission was quiet, but genuine, and Miss Marple saw the relief in her eyes, as if a burden had been lifted. Clara, her pen poised, spoke up. "But what about Victor? He was part of it, wasn't he? And the passage, there's a passage, isn't there, that led to the dining room?" Her questions were bold, and Miss Marple admired her persistence. Though she sensed Clara's ambition still burned bright, Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Mr. Crane was persuaded, I believe, by a promise of reward, but his heart wasn't in it. The passage, hidden in the cellar, was the thief's path, allowing the silver to be moved unseen. But the manor's whispers are not just of passages, they are of motives, of secrets kept and shared." Her gaze settled on Victor, who looked away, his guilt a silent confession. Dr. Mortimer leaned forward, his smile sharp, a fine deduction. "Miss Marple, the manor's secrets are indeed its strength and its weakness. I suspected a passage, but I confess I enjoyed watching the drama unfold." His admission was candid, and Miss Marple noted the glint in his eyes, as if he had played his own game, observing rather than acting. Sir Reginald, his indignation flaring, snorted. "All this talk of passages and plans, I saw nothing but good. Silver and good wine, and I'll thank you all to leave it at that." His words were gruff, but Miss Marple saw the relief in his posture, as if the truth, though uncomfortable, had restored his faith in order. As the guests dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her knitting needles clicking softly. The manor's whispers, she thought, were not of ghosts, but of human folly. Beatrice's pride, Victor's weakness, Clara's ambition, Dr. Mortimer's detachment, Sir Reginald's vanity, each had played a part, but it was the manor itself, with its hidden passages and whispered legends, that had shaped the drama. She rose, her knitting bag in hand, her mind at peace, knowing that the whispers had been heard, and the truth, like the silver, had been brought to light. Chapter 12. Return to St. Mary Med. The final morning at Blackthorn Manor broke with a rare clarity, the moorland mist parting to reveal a sky of pale blue, its light softening the Gothic spires and weathered stone of the ancient house. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of heather and damp earth, a reminder of the wild beauty that surrounded the manor's secrets. Inside, the breakfast room was quiet, the guests subdued as they prepared to depart, their bags packed and their thoughts heavy with the revelations of the past days. Miss Jane Marple sat at the table, her knitting bag at her side, her hands folded over a cup of tea that steamed gently in the morning light. Her sharp eyes, veiled by the gentle demeanour of an elderly spinster, surveyed the room with quiet satisfaction, her mind reflecting on the intricate puzzle she had unraveled. The theft of the harrow family silver had been a drama of human folly. Its clues: the muddy footprint vanishing at the dining room's side door, the broken cork marked with a 1920 vintage debt, the hidden panel in the wine cellar with its whispering draught, the sapphire-starred brooch linking Lady Beatrice Harrow to her disguise as Mrs. Evelyn Grey, and Clara Dunhill's overheard whisper of a plan gone wrong between Beatrice and Victor, crane-woven into a pattern that Miss Marple had patiently Beatrice's confession, extracted in the morning room, had revealed her desperate scheme to stage the theft for insurance money, the silver hidden in her voluminous muff. Victor's reluctant complicity, Clara's journalistic zeal, and the other guests' varied reactions had completed the picture. But it was the manor itself, with its hidden passages and whispered legends, that had given the drama its stage. Beatrice, seated at the head of the table, wore a simple grey dress, her auburn hair pinned with understated elegance, her face pale but composed. The silver, restored to its place on the sideboard, gleamed softly, a silent testament to her failed scheme and newfound resolve. She had promised, under Miss Marple's gentle urging, to sell a portion of the wine cellar to settle her debts, a practical step that eased the weight of her pride. Her eyes, meeting Miss Marple's, held a mixture of gratitude and chagrin, as if she recognized the older woman's role in both exposing and redeeming her. Sir Reginald Voss, his florid face softened by the resolution of the crisis, ate heartily, his bluster tempered by a grudging respect for the truth. "A fine mess, but it's sorted now," he said, his voice carrying across the table. "The silver's back, and I'll wager those bottles will fetch a pretty penny. No need for ghosts or seances." His comment drew a faint smile from Beatrice, and Miss Marple noted the relief in his posture, as if the manor's order had restored his faith in tradition. Clara Dunhill, her notebook closed but her eyes bright, with ambition, sipped her coffee, her questions restrained but her mind clearly at work. She had promised Miss Marple to soften her article, focusing on the manor's history rather than Beatrice's scandal, a concession that spoke of her growing respect for the older woman's wisdom. Yet Miss Marple knew Clara's ambition would find another outlet, her pen too eager to remain idle. Dr. Felix Mortimer, his lean frame relaxed, offered cryptic remarks about the fragility of human plans, his sardonic smile unchanged but his eyes warmer as they met Miss Marple's. "You've a knack for puzzles, Miss Marple," he said, his voice dry but approving. "I'd have liked to see that passage for myself, but I suppose some secrets are best left to the manor." His admission was candid, and Miss Marple saw in him a man who relished the game but respected its resolution. Victor Crane, his charm a distant memory, ate in silence, his guilt a quiet weight. His role as Beatrice's reluctant accomplice, persuaded by the promise of a share in the insurance money, had been laid bare, and his apologies, though halting, were sincere. Miss Marple's gentle counsel had urged him to make amends, perhaps, by assisting Beatrice in her honest efforts to save the manor, and he had nodded, his eyes downcast but resolute. As breakfast ended, Miss Marple rose, her knitting bag in hand, and bid farewell to the guests, her words warm but tinged with the authority of one who had seen through their facades. "It's been a most instructive weekend," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Blackthorn Manor has its whispers, but they speak of human hearts, not ghosts. I trust you'll all carry its lessons lightly." Her eyes met Beatrice's, a silent reminder of their private talk, and Beatrice nodded, her expression one of quiet resolve. The journey back to St. Mary Mead was a tranquil affair. The train rattling through the countryside, its fields golden, under the autumn sun. Miss Marple, seated by the window, watched the landscape unfold, her mind as active as her knitting needles, which resumed their rhythm in her lap. The manor's secrets, the hidden passage, the broken cork, the footprint, to nowhere had been mere props in a drama of pride and desperation. But they had reminded her of the timeless truths she had learned in her village, that motives, however grand, were rooted in the small frailties of the human heart. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair by the fire, the familiar scent of lavender and beeswax enveloping her. Her parlour was a world away from Blackthorn Manor's Gothic grandeur, its chintz, curtains, and polished furniture a testament to the quiet order she cherished. She opened her knitting bag, retrieving the broken cork, its jagged edges a memento of the case. She turned it over in her hands, her thoughts drifting to Beatrice, whose pride had nearly undone her, and Victor, whose weakness had made him complicit. Clara's ambition, Dr. Mortimer's detachment, Sir Reginald's vanity had played a role, but it was the manor's whispers, the silent truths of its hidden spaces that had guided her to the solution. She set the cork on the mantel, beside a photograph of her nephew Raymond, and resumed her knitting, the pale blue shawl taking shape under her deft fingers. The case, like her stitches, had required patience, each clue a loop in a pattern that had slowly revealed itself. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where small drama-stolen apples, whispered scandals, mirrored the grander intrigues of Blackthorn Manor. Human nature, she reflected, was the same everywhere, its secrets as predictable as the seasons, yet always in need of a keen eye to unravel. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind at peace but ever alert. The manor's whispers had been silenced, the silver restored, and Beatrice's lesson learned. But there would always be another puzzle, another secret to uncover. In the quiet of her cottage, surrounded by the familiar comforts of home, she knew that her work, like her knitting, was never truly done. For the world's small dramas held truths as enduring as the moor itself.